Having traced the origin of the dolorous blow to the Welsh story of Pryderi, the next question is whether that same tradition also contains the inspiration for the Holy Grail itself. Medieval romances are inconsistent about who actually possesses the Grail. Some identify its guardian as King Pelles, while others assign it to Pelion. Rather than treating these as contradictions, it makes sense to view both as rightful keepers. In Welsh mythology, this fits naturally, since Pwyll and Pryderi are inseparable as father and son, their stories constantly overlapping. If the Grail evolved from older Celtic traditions, then the legendary treasure connected with these two figures becomes the obvious place to begin. Welsh mythology indeed preserves such an object. In one of the poems attributed to Taliesin, Arthur leads a daring expedition into the otherworld. Among all the wonders taken from that mysterious realm, the greatest prize is the cauldron belonging to the Lord of Annwn, a figure closely identified with Pwyll. Throughout the poem, Pwyll and Pryderi appear together, while the cauldron rests inside a mysterious fortress called Caer Pedrifan, the four-cornered or four-horned castle. This supernatural stronghold stands upon the Isle of the Active Door, where its inhabitants endlessly drink sparkling wine beneath an eerie sky suspended between twilight and complete darkness. Eternal lamps illuminate the entrance to the realm of the dead, giving the entire landscape an atmosphere that feels neither fully alive nor entirely lifeless. The fortress itself carries several names, each emphasizing a different aspect of its mysterious nature. It is called Caer Medwit, the Castle of Revelry, a title reflecting its endless feasting. Elsewhere, it becomes the Castle of Riches, while additional names such as Caer Ochren, Caer Rigor, and Caer Vandwi survive without any certain explanation. Perhaps the most intriguing title, however, is Caer Sidi. This name appears in another Taliesin poem and introduces an entirely new dimension to the legend. In this second poem, the bard proudly describes his seat within Caer Sidi, a place untouched by sickness or old age. Manawydan and Pryderi are said to know its mysteries, while music from 3 organs fills the halls. Streams of the surrounding sea flow around the fortress, and above it lies an inexhaustible spring whose waters are sweeter than the finest white wine. Although many details remain difficult to interpret, the imagery paints the picture of a supernatural kingdom overflowing with abundance, music, and eternal youth. One feature of the poem deserves special attention. The very name Sidi appears to suggest movement or rotation, recalling the Welsh word for a spinning wheel. This remarkable detail finds an unexpected parallel in the Welsh Grail romance, where Peredur encounters a castle unlike anything seen before. After traveling through endless forests, Peredur finally reaches an open meadow where an enormous castle stands beyond a broad river. As he approaches, he realizes that the entire fortress is spinning with astonishing speed, turning faster than the strongest wind imaginable. Warriors stationed upon its walls unleash volleys of arrows powerful enough to pierce any armor. Trumpeters sound their horns with such force that the ground itself seems to shake. Massive lions, restrained only by iron chains, roar at the gates with terrifying fury, making the entire forest appear alive with noise. Although the romance never states that the warriors or trumpeters are mechanical figures, the scene echoes the strange music described in Taliesin's poem, where 3 organs continuously perform within Caer Sidi. One important mystery, however, remains unresolved. The legendary spring whose waters surpass wine in sweetness has no obvious counterpart in Peredur's adventure. The turning castle itself is best understood as another vision of the kingdom of the dead. Its constant rotation may even explain why the surrounding island is remembered as the Isle of the Active Door. The river flowing around its walls recalls the enchanted fortress visited by Gwalchmai in another Welsh tale. Even more striking is the fact that the terrifying lions and armed defenders never attempt to stop Peredur once he rides directly toward the gate, just as similar guardians fail to prevent Gwalchmai from entering another magical castle. Peredur's arrival contains another remarkable element. A mysterious lady welcomes him and takes both his spear and shield, carrying his weapons before him as they proceed. Instead of protecting the woman, the warrior now depends entirely upon her guidance. This reversal reflects a recurring Celtic belief that supernatural women possessed the power to lead chosen heroes safely into the other world. An almost identical idea survives in Irish tradition. During Loeg's journey to the other world, the woman Liban reaches a dangerous place and physically supports him by the shoulder. Embarrassed, Loeg protests that accepting protection from a woman is contrary to everything expected of a warrior. Liban calmly explains that without her help, he would never survive the journey. The same symbolic pattern appears, though in a gentler form, in the Welsh tale of Rhiannon, who carries visitors into Pwyll's court, demonstrating her unique ability to move freely between the mortal world and the realm beyond. Another passage in Taliesin's poetry appears to preserve this forgotten tradition. Before describing Arthur's expedition into Caer Sidi, the bard declares that no one had ever entered and returned except a mysterious figure named Gwyr. According to the poem, Gwyr gained entry through the assistance of Rhiannon, who is unexpectedly described as the messenger of Pwyll and Pryderi. He endured a terrible imprisonment within the otherworld before finally escaping, transformed forever into a bard whose wisdom had been purchased through suffering. The poem also emphasizes that the sea surrounds the corners of Caer Sidi. The Welsh word used for these corners carries several meanings, referring not only to peaks or horns, but also to the outer limits of a place. The same root appears in the name Caer Pedrifan, suggesting a fortress defined by 4 projecting corners or 4 horn-like points. Whether this refers simply to a square fortress or to something far more symbolic remains uncertain. An intriguing comparison appears in Irish literature. The Voyage of Maldwyn describes an extraordinary island divided into 4 magnificent walls, made respectively of gold, silver, copper, and crystal. These shining barriers meet at the island's center, separating it into 4 distinct regions inhabited by kings, queens, young warriors, and maidens. While not identical to Caer Sidi, the resemblance suggests that both stories preserve fragments of an older Celtic image of a perfectly ordered supernatural realm. The Welsh adjective meaning horned or having projecting points eventually appears in place names connected with mountains and fortresses alike. This linguistic trail may even explain the mysterious castle Corbenic known in the Grail romances. Medieval authors recorded its name in many different forms, including Carbonek, Corbin, Corbiere, and Corbenic, yet beneath these variations may lie an older Welsh original describing a many-cornered or horned fortress. Corbenic occupies a central place in Grail tradition as the residence of King Pelles and the sanctuary where the Holy Grail is kept. If its name truly preserves the memory of the ancient Welsh fortress, then the connection becomes difficult to ignore. The castle guarding the Grail would stand as the literary descendant of Caer Pedrifan and Caer Sidi, where Pwyll, ruler of the otherworld, once guarded his miraculous cauldron. In that case, the Grail itself may represent not an entirely new Christian creation, but the transformed heir of one of the oldest and most powerful treasures in Celtic mythology. Taliesin's poems preserve several remarkable details about the legendary cauldron associated with the ruler of the otherworld. Its rim was decorated with precious pearls, while 9 maidens sustained the fire beneath it with nothing more than their breath. Mysterious voices were said to rise from within the vessel itself, and it possessed an extraordinary power. It would never prepare food for anyone lacking courage. Cowards could stand beside it forever, yet its magic refused to serve them. Another Taliesin poem shifts attention away from the cauldron itself and instead focuses on the fortress where it was kept. Whoever occupied the honored seat within Caer Sidi became untouched by sickness and the passing of age. This vision bears a striking resemblance to the Holy Grail described in medieval romances. Whenever the sacred vessel appeared before King Pelles and his companions, it supplied every guest with exactly the food they desired. Yet its blessings were reserved only for those worthy of receiving them. Anyone morally unfit risked punishment simply by approaching too closely. Likewise, those privileged enough to remain within the Grail Chapel of King Pelur seemed to exist outside ordinary time, never growing old as the years silently passed. Beyond providing food, the Grail was also celebrated as a miraculous source of healing, capable of restoring both illness and grievous wounds. Other Grail traditions might reveal even stronger similarities, but the evidence already presented is persuasive enough. If Peles and Pelle truly preserve the memory of the Welsh figures Pwyll and Pryderi, and if Castle Corbenic represents another form of Caer Pedrifan, then the conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. The famous cauldron of the Celtic otherworld appears to have provided the model from which the Christian legend of the Holy Grail eventually emerged. Not every medieval romance describes the Grail's guardian in the same way. In many stories, he is remembered as the maimed or lame king, his physical injury reflecting the suffering of his kingdom. Other romances, however, give him a different title altogether, calling him the Fisher King or even the Rich Fisher. These alternative traditions seem to preserve another branch of Welsh legend, one that gradually divided into two separate narrative families. In one tradition, the Grail Guardians appear under names such as Gonmans, Goon, and the Fisher. In another, they become a father and son known as Bron and Alain. The name Bron almost certainly echoes the legendary Bran of Welsh mythology, suggesting that another ancient hero had quietly entered the growing Grail tradition under a slightly altered identity. Bran himself was remembered for extraordinary feasts that stretched far beyond ordinary human experience. Around his severed head at Harlech, companions celebrated for 7 years without sorrow. Later, on the enchanted island of Gwales, the festivities continued for 80 more years, as though time itself had ceased to exist. Curiously, the surviving Welsh stories never explain where the endless food came from. No magical vessel is mentioned. Bran's sacred head alone seems sufficient to sustain the entire company in perpetual abundance. Earlier episodes in Bran's legend do include a magical cauldron, although it serves a very different purpose. Rather than feeding the living, it restores life to the dead. Fallen warriors placed within it rise once more, though stripped of speech. This remarkable object closely resembles another episode preserved in Gerbert's continuation of the Perceval story, where a mysterious potion prepared by an old woman revives the dead under the command of the King of the Wasteland. The same idea appears repeatedly across Celtic mythology. One Irish tale describes a war between the Picts and the supernatural men of Fidga. Guided by the druid Drostan, the fallen are restored through a miraculous bath filled with fresh milk. Another famous legend, the Second Battle of Mag Tuired, tells how the Tuatha De Danann secretly revived their slain warriors each night by immersing them in a magical healing well. Only when their enemies discovered the secret and buried the spring beneath a great mound of stones did the endless cycle of resurrection finally end. These traditions demonstrate that miraculous vessels and sacred waters were deeply rooted in Celtic belief, although they do not directly explain the origins of the Grail itself. Better evidence comes from another group of Welsh legends centered not on resurrection, but on perilous quests for enchanted objects. One of these treasures is the Cauldron of the Lord of Anwen, already associated with Arthur's expedition into the Otherworld. Another appears in the tale of Culhwch and Olwen, where Arthur and his companions undertake a dangerous voyage to Ireland in order to seize the cauldron of Diwennach the Irishman. Unlike many later romances, this story leaves the outcome of several magical quests untold, merely listing the extraordinary objects that must be obtained before the hero can achieve his goal. Among these treasures is the enormous measure belonging to Lwaer, the only vessel capable of holding enough mead for Culhwch's wedding feast. Another object is the drinking horn of Gugaun Gogodin, destined to provide endless drink for every guest. There are also the miraculous bottles of Rhiannon Rhin Barnord, in which no liquid ever turns sour, and the enchanted flasks owned by the dwarf Gwydolwyn, capable of preserving the warmth of any drink regardless of how far it is carried across the land. This final detail is especially intriguing because it recalls one of the central legends surrounding Joseph of Arimathea. According to later Grail tradition, Joseph collected Christ's blood within the Holy Grail before carrying the sacred vessel westward or entrusting it to another guardian who would continue the journey. That guardian is often identified as Bron, whose connection with Bran becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. Several Grail romances describe Bron leading his followers toward the distant west, while subtle wordplay even links their destination with Avalon, imagined as the land where the sun disappears beyond the horizon. The voyage itself possesses unmistakably mythical qualities. Some companions are said to cross the sea while floating upon a single garment taken from the back of Joseph's son, whereas Bronn and the bearers of the Grail are guided entirely by the supernatural power of the holy vessel itself. This Christianized journey closely mirrors Bran's own legendary expedition to Ireland. In Welsh tradition, Bran's warriors sail in ships, yet the giant king himself walks through the sea, carrying his musicians upon his shoulders as though the ocean were little more than a shallow stream. Earlier comparisons have already connected Bran's endless banquet with the Grail's miraculous ability to feed all who gather around it. Now, another shared characteristic emerges. Both Bran and the Grail safely guide entire communities across dangerous waters. The resemblance is so close that it becomes increasingly difficult to regard these stories as merely parallel traditions. Instead, the Christian voyage of Bronn appears to be a transformed version of Bran's much older mythological expedition. One Grail romance even places Bronn in the islands of Ireland, a description broad enough to include not only Ireland itself, but also the legendary Western Islands so deeply woven into Celtic imagination, from Lundy and the Scillies to Bardsey, the Isle of Man, and the Enchanted Islands said to lie forever beyond the edge of the known sea. Unlike the Grail romances, however, the surviving Welsh tales about Bran never clearly identify a sacred vessel capable of feeding his companions. To imagine its original form, one must instead examine the miraculous qualities attributed to Bronn's Grail. One romance tells how only 10 or 12 loaves placed beside the Grail become sufficient to satisfy more than 500 starving people. In another episode, a desperate crowd fears death from hunger. Bronn receives instructions to enter the water and catch the first fish he finds. The fish is placed upon the table opposite the Grail, which is then covered with a cloth. Once everyone is seated, those free from sin experience complete satisfaction, receiving not only food, but also the deepest desires of their hearts. The symbolism suggests that the fish originally may have been placed directly into the vessel itself to be cooked, preserving the memory of an older magical cauldron. As the object gradually became identified with the Holy Grail, however, such an ordinary function would have seemed inappropriate for a sacred Christian relic. The vessel no longer prepared food in a literal sense. Instead, it distributed divine nourishment through miracle alone. Its refusal to bless those stained by sin also echoes the ancient Celtic tradition. Just as the Grail denied its gifts to the spiritually unworthy, the cauldron of the Lord of Annubian refused to boil food for anyone lacking courage. The Christian legend transformed moral courage into spiritual purity, but the underlying idea remained remarkably similar. In the surviving Bran stories, no magical serving vessel appears during the great banquets. Food and drink simply arrive without servants or visible preparation, as though produced by the other world itself. The same effortless abundance appears throughout Welsh and Irish fairy tradition, where supernatural feasts require no attendance because the enchanted realm provides everything its chosen guests could ever desire. The Grail romances describe another remarkable feature that echoes older Celtic tradition. As the sacred vessel moves through the hall, it provides every worthy guest with exactly what they desire to eat. Yet no one ever sees the person carrying it. Food simply appears as if by miracle, with no visible servant responsible for its arrival. The experience feels effortless and supernatural. A similar pattern appears in the Welsh legends surrounding Bran the Blessed. During the endless feasts held around his sacred head, the stories never mention servants preparing meals or carrying dishes. Even more curious, they never explain how Bran's severed head itself was transported from place to place. It was certainly not displayed like the trophy of a defeated enemy. A far more reasonable image is that it rested upon a ceremonial platter or large dish. If that interpretation is correct, it opens an intriguing possibility. Bran's sacred head displayed upon a dish, together with the spear that inflicted his mortal wound, may have inspired two of the most famous symbols in the Grail legends: the mysterious severed head presented before Peredur and the bleeding spear that accompanies it. In the Welsh version of the story, the head itself occupies the position later filled by the Holy Grail in many versions of Percival's adventure. Whether this connection can be proven or not, the similarities strongly suggest that Bronn's Grail tradition ultimately grew from older Welsh legends centered on Bran the Blessed, even if the exact original tale has not survived. Another important clue appears in the story of Kulhuch and Olwen. Among the impossible tasks demanded by the giant Isbadaden, before allowing Kulhuch to marry his daughter Olwen, is the recovery of an extraordinary object known as the Mwais of Gwydno Garanhir. The giant refuses to eat from any other vessel during the wedding feast, forcing Arthur's companions to undertake yet another dangerous quest. Although the surviving tale never describes how this object was finally obtained, its extraordinary qualities are carefully recorded. The Mwais possessed miraculous powers unlike those of an ordinary serving vessel. No matter how many people gathered around it, groups of 27 at a time could always find exactly the food each person desired most. Every guest received the perfect meal without the supply ever appearing to diminish. Later, Welsh tradition enlarges this miracle even further. According to these accounts, food prepared for only a single individual became sufficient to satisfy an entire multitude once the Mwais was opened. Eventually, the vessel itself was believed to have vanished forever alongside Merlin when he entered the mysterious glass house on Bardsey Island. It disappeared together with the other legendary treasures of Britain, a collection traditionally numbered at 13. Among all surviving Welsh legends, this object offers perhaps the closest parallel to the Holy Grail before its Christian transformation. Several striking similarities stand out immediately. Like Bronze Grail, the Mwais ultimately disappears toward the Western Islands, a destination long associated with the Celtic otherworld. Bardsey Island, lying beyond the coast of North Wales, naturally recalls the enchanted Western Islands, connected with Bron and the Grail Guardians in medieval romance. Its function also closely resembles that of the Grail. Unlike the magical cauldrons that cooked food, the Mwais simply contained and distributed it. It acted as a vessel of miraculous abundance rather than one of preparation. This distinction is significant because the Grail itself is almost always portrayed as serving food that has somehow already been divinely provided. The later Welsh descriptions also suggest that the Mwais possessed a lid and had to be opened before its contents were revealed. This detail indicates that it was probably not an open bowl, but some type of covered container, perhaps resembling a basket, chest, hamper, or storage vessel. The evolution of the Welsh word itself supports this interpretation. In later usage, MWIs came to describe a covered basket or hamper capable of holding large quantities of food. The expression Mwais is garden, for example, referred to an enormous measure of herrings, while Mwais bara meant a bread basket. The word therefore retained a strong association with storing and distributing food rather than preparing it. Related Celtic languages preserve similar meanings. In Old Cornish, the same word referred to a table. Old Irish used mias for both a table and a serving dish, and the modern Irish translation of the New Testament employs this very word for the platter on which the head of John the Baptist is presented. Scottish Gaelic preserves the same usage, while Manx Gaelic retains a related form describing a traditional measure of several hundred fish. Taken together, these linguistic and legendary traditions point toward a common Celtic concept: a miraculous vessel associated with endless provision, sacred feasting, and supernatural abundance. Long before the Holy Grail became one of the central relics of Christian romance, Welsh tradition already preserved stories of enchanted containers that supplied limitless food, rewarded the worthy, and eventually disappeared into the mysterious Western world beyond the reach of ordinary men. The unusual range of meanings attached to the Welsh word Mwais becomes easier to understand once its probable origin is considered. The term, like the related Irish mias, was most likely borrowed from the Latin mensa, meaning a table. Yet the Celtic peoples did not originally use raised tables in the Roman fashion. Among the early Britons, Irish, and probably the Norse as well, meals were commonly served from large dishes, platters, baskets, or containers placed before the diners. When the Latin word entered their languages, it was therefore applied not only to the unfamiliar Roman table, but also to the traditional objects that performed the same practical function. This explains the meaning of the Mwais of Gwydno in the story of Kulhuch and Olwen. When the giant Isbadaden demanded that Kulhuch obtain it for the wedding feast, he was not necessarily asking for a mysterious object of one precise shape. He simply wanted Gwydno's special serving vessel, the only object from which he was willing to eat during his daughter's marriage celebration. Its miraculous quality was equally straightforward. Whatever quantity of food was placed inside, it became sufficient for a far greater number of people. A meal intended for one person could feed 100, perhaps even more. This power closely matches the role of the Grail in the romances concerning the Fisher King. In Chrétien's account, the Grail continually brings nourishment to the elderly father of the Fisher King and preserves his life. Later continuators of the poem describe it supplying the company with abundant bread, wine, and every kind of food they could desire. The similarity with Gwydno's vessel is extremely close. Both are serving objects whose central miracle is not the creation of a particular meal, but the endless multiplication and distribution of food. One continuation adds a more spiritual quality. According to Gautier, a person who had seen the Grail could not be led astray by the devil during that same day. Some scholars have doubted whether these lines originally belonged to the surrounding passage, yet they do not seriously weaken the wider comparison. The Grail may have acquired additional religious meanings as the story developed, while still preserving the basic function of the older Welsh vessel. The various Grail traditions did not develop in isolation. They borrowed from one another, blended separate characters, and combined details that may once have belonged to entirely different stories. The Welsh romance of Peredur provides a likely example of this process. It portrays one of Peredur's uncles as both physically disabled and associated with fishing. Yet the lame ruler and the fisherman may originally have belonged to two independent versions of the legend. Their union in a single character was probably the result of influence from the French Grail romances. A similar blending may explain why both Bronn and Gonmans are called fishers in different branches of the tradition. In the case of Bronn, medieval authors attempted to explain the title through a miraculous fishing episode. Bronn enters the water, catches a fish, and places it beside the Grail so that his hungry people may be fed. This scene certainly offers a convenient reason for calling him a fisherman, but it may be a later explanation created after the title had already entered the story. The Grand Saint Graal extends the title beyond Bronn himself. Bronn's youngest son, Alain, is appointed guardian of the sacred vessel and commanded to take the net lying upon the Grail table. Alain casts it into the water and catches a single, enormous fish. When the people complain that one fish could never satisfy the entire gathering, he divides it into 3 portions and prays for divine help. The fish then becomes sufficient for everyone, including even those who are spiritually impure. From this miracle, Alain receives the name Rich Fisher. The title is then inherited by the guardians who follow him. These later keepers are described as more fortunate than Alain because they become crowned kings, whereas Alain himself never rules beneath a crown. Such explanations are clever, yet they do not entirely solve the problem. The title Rich Fisher seems older and more deeply rooted than the Christian episodes designed to justify it. It is therefore reasonable to suspect that it once had a meaning in Celtic tradition that later storytellers no longer fully understood. That forgotten meaning may not, however, be completely beyond recovery. Although the Fisher King is often left unnamed, a figure presented as his brother is identified in several romances. Chrétien calls him Gonemans of Gelbort. Gerber gives the name Gornumant, while Manessier calls him Goon of the Desert, meaning Goon of the Wasteland. These names appear to preserve the Welsh Gwynwas, or Gwyn, titles belonging to Gwyn ap Nudd, one of the most powerful rulers of the Welsh otherworld. Gwyn is remembered as king of the fairies, spirits, and dangerous supernatural beings. He is not described in Welsh literature as the brother of Gwydno, but the two figures are closely connected in a remarkable poem from the Black Book of Carmarthen. There they exchange words and ultimately form a strong friendship. This link brings the investigation much closer to the true identity of the Fisher King. The decisive evidence comes from Gwydno himself. His regular title was Garanhir, usually interpreted as Long Crane or Tall Heron. Such a name immediately evokes a long-legged bird standing patiently beside the water, making it entirely appropriate for a figure associated with fishing. More importantly, Gwydno possessed one of the most famous fishing weirs in Welsh legend. Every year, on the eve of the first day of May, the trap was expected to yield fish worth an enormous sum. The weir was therefore a source of almost magical wealth and abundance, making its owner quite literally a rich fisherman. The best-known tale connected with this place concerns the discovery of the infant Taliesin. Gwyddno had a single son named Elphin, a young man notorious for his recklessness, poverty, and lack of success. His father feared that Elphin had been born under an unlucky sign and decided to give him an opportunity to improve his fortune. He allowed the young man to inspect the weir on the night when its richest catch was normally expected. Elphin and his companions arrived full of hope, but the trap appeared completely empty. His men concluded that Elphin's bad luck had ruined even the prosperity of his father's famous weir. They were preparing to leave in disappointment when Elphin noticed a leather bag caught upon one of the wooden poles. Inside the bag he found not fish, silver, or treasure, but a newborn child. The infant was Taliesin, who immediately began speaking in elaborate poetry. He assured Elphin that this discovery would bring him greater value and honor than all the fish Gwyddno's weir had ever produced. This legend supplies a convincing explanation for the title Fisher King or Rich Fisher. Gwyddno owned both the magical vessel that multiplied food and the abundant fishing weir that produced extraordinary wealth. These are precisely the two characteristics later associated with the Grail Guardian: endless nourishment and a mysterious connection with fishing. There remains an important difference. In the Welsh story, the two fishing figures are Gwyddno and his son Elphin. In the Grail romances, however, the unnamed fisher is often associated not with a son, but with a brother named Goon. This inconsistency is probably another result of several Grail traditions becoming mixed together. One branch of the story featured a father and son, Bronn and Alla. Another featured the Fisher King and his companion or brother Goon. As these traditions influenced one another, names and relationships were transferred from one version to the next. A father and son could become brothers, while separate mythological figures might be merged into a single family. Alla offers a particularly revealing example. He is sometimes called Alla the Large, a name that later appears in Malory as Helias the Large. Like Elphin, he is portrayed as less fortunate than the other members of his family. Although later Grail keepers become kings, Alla never receives a crown. This lesser status closely resembles the early condition of Gwyddno's unlucky son. At the same time, Alla is occasionally described as the father of Percival or Peredur. His name may therefore preserve another Welsh personal name rather than Elphin alone. It could have developed from Eliver through repeated changes in spelling and pronunciation. The two Welsh names Elphin and Eliver may eventually have been confused by storytellers who no longer understood their original distinctions. Welsh tradition never calls Bran a fisherman, nor does it clearly give him a son named Alla, Elphin, or Eliver. These elements were probably added to the Bran tradition through contact with the branch of the story known to Chrétien and his continuators. This possibility agrees with the likelihood that Chrétien's version, or at least the material behind it, influenced later Grail narratives. The Grail stories discussed so far can therefore be arranged into three broad families. In the first, the sacred vessel belongs to Pelles. In the second, it is guarded by Bronn and his descendants. In the third, it belongs to an unnamed Fisher King. The Grail of Pelles can be traced to the cauldron of Pwyll and the fortress of the Welsh Otherworld. The Grail of the Fisher King strongly resembles the Mwais of Gwyddno, a vessel capable of feeding multitudes. The tradition of Bronn leads back toward Bran the Blessed, his sacred head, his eternal feast, and his legendary journey across the Western Sea. These three groups were never completely separate. Their characters, names, magical objects, and family relationships crossed from one branch into another. This constant interaction explains many of the apparent contradictions found in medieval romance. The stories were not created as one organized system. They grew gradually from older myths, oral traditions, written poems, Christian reinterpretations, and the imaginative inventions of successive authors. Several additional Grail names reveal the same process. Goon of the Wasteland and Gonmans of Gelbort, for example, are best understood as altered forms of Gwyn ap Nudd. a brief but brutal episode in Culhwch, and Olwen shows the ancient character of this supernatural ruler. The story concerns Cridilad, daughter of Lud of the Silver Hand. She had gone away with a warrior named Gwythyr, but before their union was completed, Gwyn ap Nudd seized her and carried her off. Gwythyr raised an army and marched against him, yet Gwyn emerged victorious. His revenge was merciless. He captured several of Gwythyr's allies, including Nwythyn and his son Caeldur. Gwyn killed Nwythyn, tore out his heart, and forced Caeldur to eat it. The horror of the act drove Caeldur permanently mad, earning him the name Caeldur the Wild. When Arthur heard what had happened, he marched north and summoned Gwyn before him. Arthur freed the prisoners and imposed a settlement between the two rivals. Cridilad was to remain in her father's house, untouched by either man. Gwyn and Gwythyr would then fight for her every year on the first day of May until the end of the world. Only on the final day of judgment would the ultimate victor be allowed to claim her. Beneath its savage humor, the tale presents Gwyn as a terrifying northern king who nevertheless accepts Arthur's authority. It also connects him with the 1st of May, the same seasonal moment associated with Gwydno's miraculous fishing weir. Such details strengthen the impression that the figures surrounding the Grail were drawn from a shared world of Celtic myth. Later, Romance writers radically transformed this pagan inheritance. Ancient rulers of the otherworld became Christian kings, hermits, Grail guardians, and ancestors of holy knights. One of the clearest examples appears in the quest of the Holy Grail, where the ancestry of Lancelot is explained through an elaborate sacred vision. Lancelot sees a man surrounded by stars, accompanied by 7 kings and 2 knights. Afterward, he reaches a hermitage, confesses his sins, and relates the vision to a holy man. The hermit explains that it reveals the destiny of Lancelot's bloodline. The story begins 42 years after the crucifixion, when Joseph of Arimathea leaves Jerusalem and travels to the eastern city of Sarras. There he assists a ruler named Evelak, who accepts baptism together with his brother-in-law Seraphi. Evelak receives the Christian name Mordrains, while Seraphi becomes Nasians. Nasians prove so devoted to the new faith that the deepest mysteries of the Holy Grail are revealed to him. Before him, only Joseph had witnessed them directly, and no later knight would experience them except through dreams or visions. King Mordrains then dreams that a vast lake flows from the body of Nasian's descendant Celidoan. 9 streams emerge from it. 8 are equal in size, while the 9th is larger than all the others combined. Christ himself appears and washes in the lake. Celidoan is the star-covered man later seen by Lancelot. The stars symbolize his knowledge of the heavens, the planets, and their courses. He becomes the first king of Scotland, while the 9 streams represent 9 descendants who will follow him. 7 of them are kings, and 2 are knights. The royal line includes figures named Warpus, Nasiens or Crestiens, Alain the Large, Helias, Jonaeans, Lancelot, and Barn. Jonans travels into Wales and marries the daughter of King Morineus, while another Lancelot marries the daughter of the King of Ireland. Ban eventually becomes the father of the more famous Lancelot. The 8th stream in the vision represents Lancelot himself, the first of the 2 knights. The 9th and greatest stream represents Galahad, conceived by Lancelot and the daughter of the Fisher King. Galahad surpasses all his ancestors, becoming the most powerful and spiritually perfect figure of the entire lineage. The genealogy is thoroughly Christian in appearance, filled with baptism, sacred visions, divine ancestry, and the descendants of Joseph of Arimathea. Yet beneath this religious structure remain fragments of much older traditions: Welsh kings, otherworld rulers, enchanted islands, mysterious vessels, wounded guardians, miraculous food, and families whose names have been reshaped almost beyond recognition. The medieval Grail legends were therefore not simply Christian stories created from nothing. They were layered constructions in which Celtic mythology survived beneath a new spiritual language. Pagan cauldrons became holy relics, magical feasts became sacred communion, rulers of the dead became wounded Christian kings, and warriors of the otherworld were transformed into the ancestors of Lancelot and Galahad. The strange overlap between the meanings of table, dish, basket, and hamper becomes much easier to understand once the history of the word itself is considered. The Welsh MWs and the Irish mias were probably borrowed from the Latin mensa, meaning table. Yet the early Britons, Irish, and perhaps the Norse did not use tables in the Roman fashion. Meals were more often arranged around large dishes, platters, baskets, or low serving vessels. As a result, when the foreign word entered Celtic speech, it was applied not only to the new concept of a table, but also to the older objects that performed the same function. This helps explain the Emwys of Gwyddno in the tale of Culhwch and Olwen. When the giant Ysbaddaden demanded that Culhwch obtain it for the wedding feast, he was not necessarily asking for a table in the modern sense. He wanted Gwyddno's own serving vessel, the one object from which he was prepared to eat during his daughter's marriage celebration. Its magical power was simple but extraordinary. Any food placed within it became enough for 100 people, perhaps even more. This miracle closely resembles the ability of the Fisher King's Grail to sustain and feed entire companies. In Chrétien's romance, the Grail repeatedly carries nourishment to the aged father of the Fisher King and keeps him alive. Later continuators describe it supplying guests with bread, wine, and every variety of food. In function, there is very little difference between this object and Gwyddno's Mwys. Both are vessels of limitless provision, transforming a small amount of food into abundance. One continuation gives the Grail an even more spiritual quality. It claims that a person who had seen the sacred vessel could not be deceived by the devil during that same day. Whether this detail belongs to the earliest form of the passage is uncertain, but it does not weaken the deeper connection. The Grail could easily acquire new Christian meanings while preserving the practical miracle of the older Welsh vessel. The Grail legends are notoriously difficult to untangle because their many versions constantly influenced one another. Characters were combined, relationships were altered, and details migrated from one tradition into another. The Welsh story of Peredur probably preserves one such mixture. It presents one of Peredur's uncles as both lame and connected with fishing, even though these traits may originally have belonged to two entirely separate versions of the tale. A similar blending may explain why both Bronn and Gonmans are called fishers in different Grail traditions. In Bronn's case, later writers attempted to justify the title with a miracle involving a fish. The Grand Saint Graal tells how Bronn's youngest son, Alain, was appointed guardian of the sacred vessel. He was ordered to take a fishing net from the Grail table and cast it into the water. Alain caught a single enormous fish, but the people complained that it could never feed the whole gathering. He then divided it into 3 portions, prayed for help, and the fish became sufficient for everyone, even those considered sinful. Because of this miracle, Alain received the title Rich Fisher. Later, Grail Guardians inherited it from him. Yet the romance adds that they were more blessed than Alain, since they became crowned kings while he never wore a crown. This story provides an explanation, but perhaps not the original one. The title, Rich Fisher, feels older than the episode created to account for it. It may have entered the Christian romances from a Celtic tradition whose full meaning was already partly forgotten. The lost explanation becomes clearer once the figures surrounding the Fisher King are examined. The king himself is often left unnamed, but a man described as his brother appears under several forms. Chrétien calls him Gonemans of Gelbort, Gerbert names him Gornumant, and Manessier calls him Goon of the Wasteland. These names almost certainly preserve the Welsh Gwyn or Gwynwas, both forms connected with Gwyn ap Nudd, the powerful ruler of the Welsh otherworld. Gwyn was remembered as king of fairies, spirits, and dangerous supernatural beings. Welsh literature does not make him the brother of Gwyddno, but an important poem in the Black Book of Carmarthen presents the two speaking together and eventually becoming close companions. The connection becomes stronger when Gwyddno's own title is considered. He was known as Garanhir, usually understood as Long Crane or Tall Heron. The image of a tall waterbird standing beside a river or shore is perfectly suited to a figure associated with fishing. More importantly, Gwyddno owned one of the most celebrated fishing weirs in Welsh tradition. Every year, on the eve of the first day of May, it was expected to produce a catch worth an enormous fortune. Gwydion was therefore not merely a fisherman, but a rich fisherman in the most literal sense. The best-known story of this weir concerns the discovery of Taliesin. Gwydno's only son was Elphin, a young man famous for his wild behavior, poverty, and complete lack of success. His father feared that he had been born beneath an unlucky star and decided to give him one opportunity to change his fate. Elphin was permitted to inspect the fishing weir on the night when its greatest catch was expected. He and his companions arrived full of hope, but the trap appeared empty. His men immediately blamed Elphin, declaring that his bad luck had destroyed even the prosperity of his father's enchanted weir. Just as they were about to leave, Elphin noticed a leather bag caught on one of the wooden poles. Inside it, he found a child. The infant was Taliesin, who immediately began speaking in elaborate poetry and promised Elphin that he would prove more valuable than all the fish ever taken from Gwydno's waters. This story provides a far more convincing origin for the title Fisher King. Gwydno owned both a miraculous vessel capable of feeding multitudes and a fishing weir associated with immense wealth. These are exactly the two qualities later joined together in the Grail tradition. There is still one difficulty. Welsh mythology gives us Gwydno and his son Elphin, whereas the Grail romances often place the Fisher King beside a brother named Goon. This is probably another consequence of traditions being combined. One branch of the legend used a father and son, Bron and Alain. Another placed the anonymous fisher beside Goon. As the stories merged, relationships shifted and characters changed positions. Alain may preserve part of Elphin's role. Like Elphin, he is presented as less fortunate than the other members of his family. He becomes a Grail guardian, but never a crowned king. Yet his name may also preserve another Welsh figure, perhaps Eliver, who was eventually confused with Elphin through repeated retelling and copying. The Grail legends can therefore be divided into three broad families. In one, the vessel belongs to Peles. In another, it is guarded by Bron. In the third, it is held by the unnamed Fisher King. The Grail of Peles can be traced toward the cauldron of Pwyll and the fortress of the Otherworld. The Grail of the Fisher King closely resembles Gwydno's Mwais. The Grail of Bron points back toward Bran the Blessed, his sacred head, his endless feast, and his journey across the sea. These traditions did not remain independent. They borrowed names, symbols, family lines, and magical powers from one another. This explains why the romances often seem inconsistent. They were not parts of a single carefully planned mythology, but layers of Celtic legend, Christian symbolism, oral storytelling, and literary invention accumulated over centuries. The same process can be seen in the supposed descendants of Nassians listed in the Gran San Graal. The genealogy includes Celiduan, Marpus, Nassians, Alain the Large, Ysais, Jonans, Lancelot, Ban, another Lancelot, and finally Galahad. Several of these names appear to preserve distorted forms of older northern British figures. Marpus, also written Warpus, strongly resembles the Welsh Gwrgwst. The same name appears in early northern history as Wrgwst or Urgust, father of the powerful Pictish ruler, remembered in later forms as Engus, son of Fergus. Nassians also appears elsewhere as Natien, a form very close to the Pictish royal name Naiton. That name may in turn correspond to Nwaithon, the unfortunate warrior in the Welsh tale of Gwyn and Gwythyr. Celiduan can likewise be connected with the Welsh Caelidr. In the Grail romance, Nassians and his son, Celiduin, are imprisoned by a persecutor of Christians named Calafia. Nassians escapes when a supernatural hand emerges from a cloud and breaks his chains. Celiduan is rescued by 9 mysterious hands, carried through the air, and delivered to the kingdom of a ruler named Label, whose daughter he later marries. Calafia is destroyed by fire from heaven. This Christian miracle may preserve a distant echo of the violent Welsh story in which Nwaithon and his son Caelidr fall into the hands of Gwyn. In the older tale, Nwaithon is killed, his heart is torn out, and Caelidr is driven mad after being forced to consume it. The Grail romance softens the horror, replacing mutilation with imprisonment and divine rescue. Celidoween is also called the first king of Scotland. This suggests that his name may preserve not only Caelida, but also Celidin, a figure called Prince Celidin in the opening of Culhwch and Olwen. Celidin appears to be a legendary personification of Caledonia itself. The French form Celidoween may therefore combine two separate Welsh names that were no longer understood by the Romance writers. Nearly every identifiable figure in this genealogy points toward northern Britain, yet the Grand Saint Graal also connects Bronn with the same family, even though Bran is not normally associated with the north. This may indicate that Bronn has been inserted into a tradition that originally belonged to the Fisher King, meaning Gwyddno. Gwyddno's name survives elsewhere in Grail romance beneath several heavily altered forms. One of the clearest is Nentres, King of Garlo. Gwyddno's kingdom was known in Welsh as the Hundred of the Bottom, later called Gwaelod. The older form of that place name closely resembles the Garlot or Garloth of Arthurian romance. The earliest written form of Gwyddno's name appears as something like Gitnu. Through repeated copying, unfamiliar spelling, and scribal error, this could easily develop into forms such as Neutres or Nentres. Another possible disguise is Mordrains, a highly important figure in the legendary early history of the Grail. In some versions, the name appears as Nudren, which lies considerably closer to the Welsh original. Mordrains is said to be the baptismal name taken by Evelach, but this second name also resembles an Old Welsh form, suggesting that two separate native figures may have been combined. The confusion grows deeper in the Huth Merlin. There, Neutre is made king of Sorhout, while Garlo is ruled by Urien and his wife Morgan. In another passage, Morgan and a second Morgan are treated as sisters, one married to Neutre and the other to Urien. The same kingdom and virtually the same wife are therefore assigned to both Neutre and Urien. This strongly suggests that the two men were at some stage regarded as versions of the same figure. The connection is strengthened by the fact that Elphin appears in Welsh tradition not only as the son of Gwyddno, but also in another genealogy as a son of Urien. This network of names reveals just how thoroughly the Grail traditions reshaped their Celtic sources. Gwyddno could become Nentres, Nutri, Nudran, or Mordrains. His territory could become Garlot. His family could become confused with that of Warien. His title as a wealthy owner of fisheries could survive as the mysterious Rich Fisher. The geography attached to these stories also points toward North Wales. In the Welsh Grail romance, several enchanted places surround the castle of Peleur: the Turning Castle, the Dead Castle, the Castle of Maidens, and the Isle of Glanog. The ruler of the Dead Castle wages war against his own brother Peleur. After Peleur's death, he seizes the castle and keeps it until Peredur storms the stronghold. The same tyrant attacks the Queen of the Castle of Maidens and regularly visits the Isle of Glanog. The Queen's castle appears to have stood near Penman at the eastern edge of Anglesey. The Isle of Glanog can be identified with the island later known as Priestholm or Puffin Island, separated from Anglesey by a narrow channel. A Welsh chronicle records that in the year 629 King Cadwallon was blockaded on this island by the fleet of Edwin of Northumbria. The siege failed and Cadwallon escaped across the sea to Ireland. Glanog himself is otherwise remembered only as the father of Helig, ruler of a legendary lowland territory said to have been swallowed by the sea along the coast of North Wales. Helig was called the Bald, recalling another drowned land ruler, Tegid the Bald, whose kingdom was believed to lie beneath the waters of Bala Lake. Glanog and Helig may therefore represent another form of Gwyddno and Elphin. Both pairs belong to stories of lost coastal kingdoms, miraculous abundance, and lands overwhelmed by water. The association of the Turning Castle with this submerged country is especially important. The Turning Castle has already been compared with Caer Sidi, the rotating fortress of the Otherworld in Taliesin's poetry. Taliesin boasts that he possessed a secure seat there, and Welsh tradition also says that Gwyddno granted him land in the northern district of Arlecwed. These stories may preserve different fragments of the same forgotten myth. The constant appearance of cauldrons, dishes, baskets, and sacred containers in Celtic literature may seem strange to a modern audience. Yet these objects were rarely concerned with food alone. They often carried deeper meanings connected with wisdom, poetry, memory, and supernatural inspiration. The Book of Taliesin speaks of three muses rising from the cauldron of the giant Ogerfin, a figure associated with bardic knowledge and the invention of writing. Here the cauldron becomes not merely a vessel of nourishment, but a source of creative power. The same symbolism appears outside the Celtic world. In Old Norse poetry, the cup of the dwarfs could represent thought, wisdom, and poetic inspiration. In ancient Indian religion, the sacred drink soma was believed to grant divine vision and ecstatic knowledge. These traditions may preserve the memory of a very ancient ritual, drink consumed by priests, poets, or medicine men in order to enter an altered state of consciousness. The magical vessel held not only food or liquid, but access to another level of understanding. Ancient Greek religion offers another revealing comparison. The sacred tripod at Delphi was itself a device designed to support a vessel above a fire. At the oracle of Apollo, however, the cauldron had disappeared, and the prophetess sat directly upon the tripod over a chasm in the earth. Vapors rising from below took the place of the flames kindled beneath the Celtic cauldron by the breath of 9 maidens. At Delphi, divine utterances emerged through the body of the priestess. In Taliesin's world, voices issued from the vessel itself, or muses rose from within it. The Greek tradition placed the human medium above the sacred opening. The Celtic tradition preserved the older and more mysterious image of the cauldron. Its messages still required interpretation, perhaps by a druid or inspired bard capable of understanding the voices of the otherworld. Seen in this wider setting, the Holy Grail becomes far more than a Christian relic. Behind it stands an ancient family of sacred vessels associated with abundance, kingship, healing, poetic inspiration, prophecy, and passage into the supernatural world. The Grail romances did not erase those older meanings. They transformed them, allowing the cauldron of Celtic myth to survive beneath the appearance of the most celebrated holy vessel in medieval literature. Arthurian geography is filled with places that seem to belong partly to the real world and partly to myth, but few are more mysterious than the kingdom of Melwas. The old stories never agree completely on where his realm was located. Instead, they preserve several overlapping traditions, each placing him in a landscape that carries the atmosphere of the other world. Malory brought the legend close to London. After making Westminster one of Arthur's principal centres, he placed the castle of Meligrance, his version of Melwas, only 7 miles away on the opposite bank of the Thames. In this retelling, the river becomes far more than a natural boundary. It takes on the symbolic role of the river, separating the living world from the kingdom of death. When Lancelot crosses it on horseback, in his desperate attempt to rescue Guinevere, his journey resembles the ancient passage of a hero into the realm beyond. The same region contains other distorted fragments of legendary geography. Guildford may survive in Grail romance under names such as Castle Gallifort and Gelbort, the homeland of Gonman's Incretian story. Malory also identifies Astolat, the home of Elaine, with Guildford. Real English locations were therefore drawn into the myth, while their names were reshaped until they sounded like distant castles from another world. Later, Welsh writers offer a different tradition. They describe Melwas as a ruler who came from Scotland. This association may have developed in the same way that Mordred was increasingly connected with the Picts and Scots after the time of Geoffrey of Monmouth. In some accounts, Mordred even becomes a Pictish prince. Melwas may have undergone a similar transformation, becoming identified as a northern or Gaelic ruler. A trace of this belief may survive in an Irish glossary that refers to Glastonbury as the Glastonbury of the Gaels. Since the Latin name for the Gaels was often Scoti, the phrase may preserve an Irish memory of an older British tradition in which the ruler of Glastonbury was imagined as a Goidelic or Scottish figure. Whether this legend reflects any actual Irish settlement in Somerset or the Gower Peninsula is impossible to determine with certainty. Yet the mythical pattern itself is easy to understand. Celtic stories often transferred the otherworld into a real geographical location. In the Tale of Bran, for example, an expedition that may originally have led into the realm of the dead becomes a voyage to Ireland. Once the supernatural kingdom was identified with Ireland, its ruler would naturally be imagined as an Irish or Gaelic king. The earliest writers who mention Melwas, however, do not place his kingdom in Ireland. The author of the Life of Gildas and Chrétien de Troyes both locate it much closer to Arthur's own world. In the Life of Gildas, Melwas rules a region called the Summer Country, a name generally understood as Somerset. Glastonbury appears as the central stronghold of this territory, protected by wetlands and difficult approaches. Chrétien gives the kingdom a different name, calling Melwas ruler of Goire, a land from which no traveler returns. He also places Melwas and his father in a capital called Bade. Bade is almost certainly a bath. Goire, meanwhile, strongly resembles Gwir or Gower, the peninsula extending into the sea along the coast of South Wales. At first, these locations seem incompatible. Bath, Somerset, Glastonbury, and Gower cannot all be the same kingdom. Yet the confusion becomes understandable when two separate Celtic ideas about the realm of the dead are considered. According to one tradition, the otherworld lay beyond the sea or beneath its waters. It could be imagined as a distant island reached only by crossing a dangerous channel. The Byzantine writer Procopius preserves a famous story in which the souls of the dead are transported by boat from the continental coast to a mysterious island called Brittia. From the opposite shore of the Severn, the Gower Peninsula could easily appear as a dim and distant land rising from the sea. In mythic imagination, it could become the unreachable kingdom of Melwas. A second and equally ancient tradition placed the supernatural realm inside the earth. Its entrance might be hidden within a hill, a burial mound, or a hollow beneath the ground. Irish legends frequently describe fairy rulers living inside great mounds, while Welsh tradition usually places the fairies beneath hills. In some parts of Wales, especially near Snowdon, they were instead believed to inhabit a hidden world below the waters of lakes. Glastonbury fits both models perfectly. Before the surrounding marshes were drained, the settlement rose like an island above the flooded landscape. At the same time, Glastonbury Tor stood over the region like an enormous enchanted hill. The place could therefore be imagined either as an island beyond the waters or as a gateway into a kingdom hidden beneath the earth. This double character may explain why Welsh tradition called such places Wye on Wais. The word usually means island, but in Welsh geography it can also describe elevated ground surrounded by marshes or low-lying country, even when the surrounding land is not permanently covered by water. William of Malmesbury records that Glastonbury's ancient British name was Ynys-Wytrin, which he translated as the Island of Glass. The same idea appears in Chrétien's poetry, where the kingdom becomes the Isle of Glass. In his Romance of Eric, Chrétien describes it as a land of perfect weather, untouched by storm, thunder, lightning, dangerous animals, extreme heat, or winter. It is an eternal summer country ruled by Mahaloas, another form of Melwas. This description reveals the true nature of the place. It is not merely an English island or fortress. It belongs to the ancient family of blessed western lands where suffering, age, and harsh weather no longer exist. Its shining surface, peaceful climate, and distance from ordinary life make it another version of the Celtic paradise. Centuries later, the monks of Glastonbury transformed these traditions for their own purposes. They claimed that Joseph of Arimathea had founded their monastery and personally introduced Christianity into Britain. According to this version of history, Glastonbury possessed a sacred authority older than the mission of Rome itself. Such a claim had enormous political value. If Joseph had established Christianity in Britain immediately after the death of Christ, then the English Church could present itself as independent of later Roman authority. This argument appealed strongly to King Henry II, whose long conflict with the papacy reached its darkest moment in the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury. The claims of Glastonbury also weakened the authority of St. David's and the religious traditions of the Welsh. Henry had every reason to support a story that undermined both Rome and the independent spiritual prestige of Wales. He is said to have ordered an investigation into the monastery's ancient claims and accepted them as genuine. The monks eventually repaid this support with a discovery of extraordinary convenience. In 1189, they announced that they had found the graves of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere at Glastonbury. They also claimed to have uncovered the burial place of Gawain, Arthur's celebrated nephew and companion. The timing was politically useful. Welsh resistance was sustained in part by the belief that Arthur had never truly died and would one day return to lead his people against their enemies. By displaying his supposed grave, the monks could challenge that hope directly. A buried Arthur could not return. The legendary king had been transformed from a promised savior into a dead ruler safely contained within an English monastery. Yet Glastonbury's association with Avalon was probably far older than this carefully staged discovery. The monks may have exploited the legend, but they did not necessarily invent it. For generations, perhaps for centuries, local tradition may already have identified Glastonbury with the mysterious island of Arthur's final journey. William of Malmesbury offers more than one explanation for the name Avalon. One derives it from the British word for apples, presenting the island as the Isle of Apples. The modern Welsh word for apple is eifal, while related forms could also refer to an apple tree. This would fit the later image of Avalon as a fertile paradise covered in orchards. Malmesbury also preserves a strange story claiming that the name arose from an early settler named Glastennig. According to the tale, Glastennig followed a remarkable sow through western Britain until it stopped near the old church at Glastonbury. The animal was found beneath an apple tree while suckling its piglets. Impressed by the richness of the land, Glastennig settled there with his family, and the place supposedly took its name from him. The sow itself was no ordinary animal. Rather than 4 legs, it was said to possess 8. Such a detail immediately gives the story the character of myth rather than history. The animal functions as a supernatural guide, leading the founder through wild and watery country toward a chosen sacred place. The narrative also connects Glastonbury with apples. The fruit of the tree beneath which the sow was discovered became famous as the apples of the old church. Glastennig then supposedly named the island Avalon because apples were abundant there. Another explanation connected Avalon with a ruler named Avaloch, who was said to have lived there with his daughters because of the island's secrecy and isolation. This figure may preserve a far older mythological tradition hidden beneath the medieval attempt to explain the name. Malmesbury claimed that these stories came from ancient British writings. No exact source matching his description has survived, but a related manuscript containing early genealogies helps reveal how the story may have developed. The manuscript includes a genealogy leading back to a figure named Glast. Malmesbury seems to have misunderstood this family line and treated its names as a list of brothers descended from the famous northern ruler Cunedda. The very next section of the manuscript gives the actual sons of Cunedda under entirely different names, showing that the chronicler had confused 2 separate traditions. An obscure note connects Glast with the longer name Glastennig. This makes it likely that Malmesbury's Glastying should be corrected to Glastennig or Glastennig. The entire tradition appears to have been an early attempt to explain the origin of the name Glastonbury through a legendary founder. Names such as Glast and Glastennig naturally suggested a connection with glass, especially to English-speaking writers. Yet this does not necessarily mean that the image of a glass island was created only through wordplay. The idea may have existed long before English scholars attempted to explain the place name. Celtic tradition already knew mysterious towers and islands made of glass. The Historia Brittonum, traditionally associated with Nennius, describes a glass tower standing in the middle of the sea. Such imagery belongs naturally to stories of distant supernatural islands, shining fortresses, and inaccessible kingdoms beyond the human world. Avalon may have developed in the same way. Glastonbury might genuinely have been famous for apple trees, and an apple tree may also have appeared in one version of the myth as a sacred or magical object. None of this proves, however, that the name Avalon originally meant Isle of Apples. The orchard explanation may have been a later attempt to make sense of an ancient name whose true meaning had already been forgotten. Alternatively, the title Island of Apples may have grown from an authentic myth in which a miraculous tree stood at the center of the Western paradise. The distinction is difficult to recover. Medieval authors may have begun with a false linguistic explanation and then built stories around it. Yet they may also have inherited a genuine tradition about a sacred tree and used it to reinterpret the name. Whatever its linguistic origin, Avalon remained a place where geography and mythology became inseparable. It could be Glastonbury rising from the marshes, Gower seen across the sea, an underground fairy kingdom, a shining island of glass, or a western paradise filled with fruit trees. Each location preserved one aspect of the same ancient idea, a hidden realm lying just beyond the borders of the familiar world. Melwas belongs to that landscape. Whether he rules from Somerset, Bath, Gower, Scotland, or the Isle of Glass, he remains the guardian of a kingdom from which ordinary men do not easily return. Lancelot's rescue of the Queen is therefore more than a journey between castles. It is the descent of a living hero into a land associated with death, enchantment, and eternal summer, followed by his struggle to bring Guinevere back into Arthur's world. For centuries, Celtic tradition imagined a mysterious realm that lay beyond the ordinary world, a place where death, healing, and immortality seemed to exist side by side. This legendary land eventually became known as Avalon, but its earliest literary descriptions reveal a far richer and more complex vision than the later medieval romances. Rather than presenting it as merely a magical island, early writers portrayed it as a supernatural kingdom existing on the edge of human understanding, where time flowed differently and extraordinary beings ruled over an eternal paradise. One of the earliest detailed accounts appears in Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings. He describes an island often called the Isle of Apples, a land so naturally abundant that no one needed to cultivate its fields. Crops ripened without labor, vineyards flourished on their own, fruit trees remained forever productive, and the earth constantly renewed itself. Those fortunate enough to reach this place were said to enjoy lives stretching far beyond the normal limits of humanity. The island was governed by 9 noble sisters whose wisdom and healing abilities made the realm famous throughout Arthurian tradition. Among them stood Morgan, the gifted enchantress who would later become inseparably linked with King Arthur's final journey. Another medieval poet expanded this vision by presenting Avalon as a peaceful kingdom untouched by violence, crime, war, disease, or old age. Spring never faded there, flowers bloomed endlessly, and happiness replaced suffering. Everything was shared rather than owned, creating an ideal society free from the conflicts of the mortal world. At the heart of this enchanted kingdom ruled a beautiful queen attended by equally graceful maidens. It was to this royal court that the wounded Arthur was carried after his last great battle. Instead of returning immediately to Britain, he remained under Morgan's care while his wounds slowly healed, giving rise to the enduring belief that Arthur never truly died, but simply awaited the proper moment to return. The name Avalon itself became the subject of many medieval interpretations. While some connected it with apples because of the island's extraordinary orchards, others believed it referred to an ancient ruler whose name gradually evolved into forms such as Avalo, Avaloc, or Avalach. Medieval chroniclers even claimed that this mysterious king lived upon the island with his daughters, an image that closely matches the stories describing Morgan surrounded by a circle of noble women. Such similarities suggest that these figures may preserve memories of much older Celtic traditions in which powerful supernatural families ruled the other world. Genealogies compiled centuries later attempted to fit these legendary figures into Christian history, linking Avaloc to famous ancestral lines and legendary kings. Yet beneath these efforts, scholars have often recognized traces of a much older mythology. Rather than an ordinary king, Avaloc appears to preserve characteristics of an ancient supernatural being whose identity belonged to the mysterious world beyond human life. His connection with Avalon suggests that he ruled not simply an island, but a gateway between life and death. This darker interpretation becomes even more convincing when later Arthurian literature introduces a figure named Evalach. Although transformed into a Christian king within the Grail legends, Ivalak bears remarkable similarities to the older Avallac'h traditions. In these stories, he is depicted as an aged ruler covered with wounds, suspended between life and death, whose mysterious origins remain unknown even to those around him. His strange condition echoes several other legendary figures whose existence seems to bridge the worlds of the living and the dead. Instead of representing a historical monarch, Ivalak appears to preserve fragments of an ancient myth that Christian writers adapted into a new religious framework. The association between Avalon and the realm of the dead becomes even clearer in Welsh tradition through the story of Saint Colin. According to the legend, the saint settled near Glastonbury Tor, seeking solitude for prayer. Local people spoke openly of Gwyn ap Nudd, whom they regarded as the ruler of Annobwn, the Welsh otherworld, and the king of the fairies. Colin rejected this belief, declaring that such beings were not noble spirits, but demons. Soon afterward, a messenger arrived carrying an invitation from Gwyn himself, commanding the saint to appear before him on the summit of the hill. Colin ignored the summons more than once, but after repeated warnings, he finally climbed the hill, carrying only holy water. There, he encountered an astonishing sight. Before him stood a magnificent castle surrounded by richly dressed warriors, elegant young women, swift horses, musicians, and every luxury imaginable. The scene resembled the court of a mighty earthly king, overflowing with beauty and abundance. Gwyn welcomed the saint warmly and invited him to share an extravagant feast, promising every pleasure a guest could desire. Colin, however, refused the invitation. Looking beyond the dazzling appearance of the court, he declared that its splendid banquet was nothing more than leaves from trees disguised as food. When Gwyn proudly displayed the brilliant clothing worn by his followers, Colin interpreted their colors as symbols of punishment rather than glory. The brilliant red represented consuming fire, while the deep blue reflected unbearable cold. With a single act, the saint sprinkled holy water over the entire assembly. Instantly, the magnificent palace disappeared. The musicians, the horses, the warriors, the beautiful maidens, and even Gwyn's royal court dissolved into nothing. In their place remained only rough patches of grass upon the hillside. The dazzling kingdom had been revealed as an illusion, reinforcing the Christian belief that the ancient rulers of the Celtic otherworld possessed only deceptive power. Glastonbury Tor later became associated with Saint Michael, the great archangel who frequently replaced older supernatural guardians at sacred sites across Celtic lands. Similar traditions developed elsewhere. The rocky island of Mont Saint-Michel on the Norman coast became linked with Arthur's battle against a fearsome giant, while Cornwall's St. Michael's Mount inherited comparable sacred associations despite preserving few surviving legends. Ireland's Skellig Michael also joined this pattern, remembered both as a holy retreat and as the legendary resting place of ancient heroes. These recurring dedications suggest that places once connected with older supernatural traditions gradually became centers of Christian devotion. Even the giant defeated by Arthur at Mont Saint-Michel may preserve echoes of older mythology. Medieval writers recorded his name as Dinnebuch, a name strikingly similar to certain Welsh place names that later became associated with monstrous beings. Local legends remembered these places as former homes of destructive creatures whose defeat symbolized the triumph of order over chaos. Whether these giants represented memories of forgotten folklore or transformed images of ancient deities, they reveal how medieval storytellers blended history, legend, and religion into a single narrative. Through these evolving traditions, Avalon emerged not simply as Arthur's final destination, but as the enduring symbol of the mysterious frontier where Celtic mythology and Christian imagination met. Saint Michael's rise as the spiritual successor to Gwyn ap Nudd is not difficult to explain. In Christian belief, Michael stood as the commander of heaven's armies, the angel who cast Satan from his place of power and kept the forces of evil under divine restraint. Welsh tradition assigned a remarkably similar role to Gwyn. Although remembered as a ruler of the otherworld and a figure closely associated with battlefields and wandering spirits, he was also believed to keep the dangerous powers of Annobwn from overwhelming the human world. This belief appears clearly in the Welsh tale of Culhwch and Olwen. When Culhwch seeks permission to hunt the monstrous boar Twrch Traeth, Ysbaddaden tells him that such a hunt cannot begin until Gwyn son of Nudd is found. God, he explains, entrusted Gwyn with the command of the demons of Annwn so that they would not escape and destroy the living world. Gwyn therefore serves not merely as a supernatural king, but as the guardian who restrains chaos itself. Christian tradition gave Saint Michael an almost identical responsibility. He was believed to escort souls after death, defend them against evil spirits, and stand beside the scales at the Last Judgment while the fate of every soul was decided. Medieval art frequently depicts Michael preventing demons from stealing souls or influencing the final judgment. In this role, he effectively replaced the older Celtic Lord of the Dead, transforming familiar beliefs into a Christian framework without entirely erasing their earlier character. This helps explain why churches dedicated to Saint Michael became especially numerous throughout Wales. Many were established on lonely hilltops, rocky heights, or ancient sacred places that earlier generations had regarded with fear or reverence. Such locations had long been associated with supernatural beings, wandering spirits, or darker powers inherited from Celtic tradition. By dedicating these sites to Michael, Christianity symbolically claimed them, presenting the archangel as the ultimate protector against the unseen dangers that people believed lurked in forests, mountains, and the evening mist. The connections between Glastonbury, Avaloch, and Gwyn ap Nudd suggest that these figures belong to a broader network of Celtic beliefs concerning the otherworld. Yet another question naturally arises. If Avaloch and Gwyn share so many characteristics, where does Melwas fit within this tradition? The answer may lie in the remarkable tendency of Celtic mythology to preserve the same supernatural figure under several different names. The name Melwas itself reflects its Cornish pronunciation, while its Welsh equivalent appears as Maelwas. Geoffrey of Monmouth, however, also records a longer form that resembles Gwynwas. The two names carry different meanings, but may once have referred to the same divine figure. Gwynwas can be understood as the fair youth, or the white youth, whereas Maelwas suggests a noble or princely young ruler. Over time, regional traditions may have favored one name over another. Cornish storytellers retained Melwas, while Welsh tradition increasingly preferred the shorter and more familiar Gwyn. Whether these names originally described a single being cannot be proven with certainty, but Geoffrey's own writings reveal how easily mythology and history became intertwined. In one narrative, Melwas and Gwynwas appear as entirely separate rulers. Melwas becomes king of the Picts, while Gwynwas is presented as king of the Huns. Together, they encounter Ursula and her companions after their ships are wrecked during a journey across the sea. The virgins are massacred, and the two kings launch an invasion of Britain. Their campaign initially meets success, but Roman forces eventually drive them northward. Retreating first to Ireland, they later return with allies drawn from the Scots and Scandinavian peoples, once again ravaging Britain. Eventually, they are forced back beyond the great northern frontier, where they continue threatening the island from the lands beyond the wall, while Britain's rulers restore order farther south. In later episodes, Geoffrey transforms these same figures into loyal rulers serving King Arthur, assigning Melwas the kingship of Iceland and Gwynwas that of Orkney. Such shifting identities reveal how legendary characters could be repeatedly reshaped to fit different narratives. The story of Saint Ursula also demonstrates this blending of tradition. Geoffrey identifies her as the daughter of a Cornish king named Dionotus, while earlier continental accounts place her death at Cologne during the invasion of the Huns under Attila. Even the names of her family differ from one source to another, suggesting that storytellers freely adapted historical memories, local legends, and mythical themes into new combinations. Melwas himself also appears elsewhere in Arthurian tradition. Welsh literature includes a warrior called Maelwys among Arthur's companions, while Irish history preserves the name of Mael Uma, son of Baidan, an Ulster prince who campaigned alongside the Dalriadic Scots in Britain. Medieval romance seems to have merged these distinct traditions. As stories spread across Britain and France, the historical Irish prince and the mythical Melwas gradually became confused, eventually producing the romance figure whose father appears under names such as Bademagu. Geoffrey consistently associates Melwas and Gwynwas with the far northern world. They are linked with the Picts, the Scots, Orkney, Iceland, and the islands beyond Britain's shores. From a Celtic perspective, these distant regions occupied the edge of the known world, making them natural settings for legends connected with the other world. Just as continental romances often placed supernatural beings among the Huns or other distant peoples, Welsh tradition frequently projected similar mysteries onto the northern lands inhabited by Picts and Scots. This geographical symbolism also sheds light on Glastonbury's legendary importance. If Glastonbury truly represented Avalok's enchanted island, it could easily be identified with the mythical land of summer, known in Welsh tradition as Gwlad yr Haf. This was no ordinary country, but an ideal realm existing somewhere beyond the limits of everyday experience. Medieval Welsh tradition even claimed that Hu the Mighty led the ancestors of the Welsh people from this marvelous land before they reached Britain. Later, writers attempted to identify it with distant places such as Taprobane or Ceylon, illustrating how mythical geography gradually became blended with real geography. Although later generations attached the name Somerset to the district surrounding Glastonbury, the older concept of the Land of Summer never entirely lost its legendary character. In Welsh folklore, the expression continued to suggest a mysterious country lying somewhere far away, almost beyond the reach of ordinary travelers. If Melwas ruled the magical glass island identified with Glastonbury, then he naturally became the king of this eternal summer kingdom. Other traditions, however, placed Melwas somewhere entirely different. Instead of Somerset, they made him ruler of Gower, the dramatic peninsula stretching into the Bristol Channel. Medieval romance eventually combined both versions of the legend, describing Melwas as King of Gore while locating his royal residence at Bath. These conflicting traditions reflect the gradual merging of separate regional myths into a single Arthurian narrative. Much of the surviving evidence points toward a Cornish rather than a Welsh origin for Melwas. From Cornwall, the distant coastline of Gower would have appeared as a fitting entrance to the supernatural world across the sea. The same tradition also connected Bran, another mysterious figure of Celtic legend, with Gower, perhaps explaining later Arthurian names such as Brandagore. Morgan Le Fay herself eventually became associated with this region. Fleeing Arthur's anger, she was said to have found refuge in Gower, where she established powerful fortresses and ruled as queen. Welsh tradition preserves a similar memory by making her husband, Urien, king of Gower. Even ancient Welsh poetry preserves echoes of these beliefs. The Black Book of Carmarthen mentions a place called Gwanas in Gower as the burial place of legendary heroes and mysterious companies associated with Earth and Anoeth. Welsh legend also speaks of the dreadful prison of Earth and Anoeth, a vast structure said to have been built entirely from human bones. Rather than describing a literal prison, this haunting image almost certainly represents another vision of the realm of the dead. Like the collapsing enchanted castle that appears elsewhere in Arthurian legend, it reflects an enduring Celtic belief that beyond the visible world stood another kingdom, a place where myth, memory, and death were forever intertwined. Morgan Le Fay occupies a unique position in Arthurian tradition because she is almost certainly the same supernatural woman who appears elsewhere under the older name Morgan. Rather than representing two different characters, these figures are better understood as different portrayals of a single enchantress whose nature changes according to the story being told. In one tale, she is a compassionate healer who carries the wounded Arthur to Avalon and carefully tends his injuries. In another, she becomes a dangerous rival, using her magical powers against the heroes of Camelot. Such contradictions are common in Celtic mythology, where beings from the other world often embody both generosity and hostility depending on the circumstances. The same pattern appears in the legends surrounding the Lady of the Lake. Medieval romances introduce several women under this title, each performing a different role. One presents Arthur with the legendary sword Excalibur in exchange for a future promise. Another imprisons Merlin within an enchanted stone chamber, bringing an end to his earthly wanderings. Yet another devotes herself to Arthur's protection, while a different Lady of the Lake watches over Lancelot throughout his adventures. Rather than imagining all of these as unrelated individuals, it is far more likely that they preserve separate traditions about one ancient lake goddess whose identity gradually fragmented as Arthurian literature evolved. The name Morgan itself points toward an aquatic origin. Its meaning is closely connected with the sea, suggesting someone born of the ocean or daughter of the waters. This association survives not only in Welsh tradition, but also in Ireland, where a remarkably similar figure appears under the name Muirgan. Irish legend remembers her as Liban, a woman entrusted with guarding a sacred spring. When her duty was neglected, the waters burst forth and created what later became Lough Neagh. Swept beneath the waves, Liban was transformed into a creature that was half woman and half fish, wandering through the underwater world for centuries before finally being caught by the followers of a Christian saint. After receiving baptism, she died as a holy woman, and her memory eventually became associated with a church. Behind the Christian story, however, scholars have long recognized the outline of a much older water goddess whose identity was adapted into a new religious setting. Irish tradition actually preserves more than one Liban. Another appears as the wife of Labraid of the Swift Hand, living upon a mysterious island alongside her sister Fand. Although medieval storytellers treated these women as separate individuals, they may ultimately descend from the same mythical source. Such duplication is a familiar feature of Celtic legend, where ancient deities often survive under multiple names and in different stories that preserve only fragments of their original character. When Morgan reappears in Arthurian romance, she is frequently linked with the Kingdom of Gower. Some medieval writers describe her as its queen, while her husband Urien is presented as its ruler. Welsh tradition, however, usually places Urien much farther north, connecting him with the ancient kingdom of Reged. This creates an intriguing problem because some romances seem to identify Gower and Reged with one another, even though geography suggests otherwise. Evidence from Welsh poetry hints that another Reged may once have existed in Western Wales. A poem attributed to the 12th century prince Hywel ap Owain speaks of reaching the land of Reged in a remarkably short journey from Meilianid. Later poets associated the same ancient name with the region around modern Aberystwyth, describing it as a coastal stronghold overlooking the sea. Long before the medieval castle dominated the landscape, this rocky headland appears to have been surrounded by water during high tides, giving it the appearance of an island. Medieval records even suggest that access was once limited to a bridge, reinforcing the impression that it occupied a naturally isolated position. The landscape around Aberystwyth has changed considerably over the centuries. Coastal erosion and shifting river channels have altered the shoreline, making it difficult to reconstruct its earlier appearance. The modern town stands between the rivers Rheidol and Ystwyth, although geological evidence and historical descriptions suggest that their courses were once different. Such changes help explain why an apparently ordinary coastal settlement could once have inspired traditions describing it as an island separated from the mainland. Howell's poem contains an especially striking description of Reged, calling it a land that exists between night and day. This curious phrase may preserve an ancient mythological idea rather than a geographical observation. Celtic tradition frequently imagined the otherworld as occupying a boundary between opposing states, between light and darkness, life and death, or the visible and invisible worlds. In that sense, Rigid was not merely a kingdom, but a symbolic frontier where ordinary reality faded into the supernatural. Another ancient name strengthens this interpretation. Welsh tradition also knew a mysterious realm called Ir Echwyd, the Land of Sunset. Like Avalon, it represented a place lying beyond the western horizon, where the souls of the dead or supernatural beings were believed to dwell. The setting sun naturally became a powerful symbol of departure from the world of the living, making Western Islands ideal locations for the entrances to the Celtic otherworld. Glastonbury, Gower, and Western Reged are only part of a much larger network of sacred islands found throughout Celtic tradition. Time and again, islands appear not simply as remote places, but as gateways to supernatural realms inhabited by immortal rulers, enchanted women, and heroic dead. Their isolation made them perfect settings for stories in which ordinary geography blended with myth. One famous example is the Isle of Gwales, remembered as a place where feasting never came to an end and hospitality was eternal. Heroes who entered this island found themselves in a world untouched by hunger, hardship, or the passage of time. Similar ideas appear in many ancient traditions, where the home of a divine ruler is placed upon a distant island beyond the sea. Another mysterious location appears in Arthurian romance under the name Surluse. Many historians believe this land reflects the Isles of Scilly, which were known by similar names in several medieval languages. Roman authorities once used these islands as places of exile, while later romances transformed them into the domain of Galahad's mighty ally, the High Prince Galahalt. Their distant position beyond Britain's southwestern coast made them natural candidates for association with the legendary lands of the Otherworld. Bardsey Island, off the coast of North Wales, also acquired extraordinary importance in Welsh tradition. Legends claimed that Merlin withdrew there with his companions, carrying Britain's sacred treasures into a hidden glass house. Older Welsh names for the island connect it with mysterious giant figures remembered in early medieval tradition. One such giant, Benlli, appears elsewhere in Welsh legend as a proud ruler destroyed by divine fire after defying a saint. His story echoes those of other dark rulers, whose defeat symbolizes the triumph of Christian authority over older supernatural powers. Puffin Island, known in Welsh as Ynys Lannog, occupies a similar place in Grail tradition. It becomes the stronghold of a fearsome king associated with death and destruction, whose repeated attacks terrorize a neighboring queen and her knights. Peredur eventually sails to the island and defeats the tyrant in battle, although the defeated ruler narrowly escapes before receiving the final blow. Once again, an isolated island serves as the residence of a supernatural enemy whose kingdom stands apart from the ordinary world. The Isle of Man occupies an even more important position in Irish mythology. It was regarded as the home of Manannán mac Lir, one of the greatest magical figures in Celtic tradition. Master of the sea and guide of souls, Manannán ruled an enchanted kingdom concealed beyond the western waters. Other legends identify the island with the realm of Midir, king of the fairies, whose magical treasures included an inexhaustible cauldron and miraculous cattle. In different traditions, these same stories became linked with the legendary city of Falias, one of the mythical homelands of the Tuatha De Danann. Farther north lies Tory Island, another place deeply connected with Irish myth. It was remembered as the home of the terrifying Barlaw of the Evil Eye and the birthplace of his grandson Lugh, one of the greatest heroes of Celtic legend. Other tales describe Tory as the headquarters of the Fomorian kings, whose stronghold was eventually attacked by the descendants of Nemed in a disastrous campaign that ended beneath the waves. Once again, the island becomes both a fortress of supernatural enemies and a stage upon which cosmic struggles unfold. Anglesey also preserves echoes of these ancient beliefs. Irish tradition linked it with the Fomorian ruler Conaing, while Welsh poetry associated it with March ap Merchion, a legendary king remembered for possessing the ears of a horse. According to the famous tale, March executed every barber who discovered his secret, yet truth could not remain hidden forever. Reeds eventually grew from the graves of the murdered men, and when a musician fashioned one into a pipe, the instrument revealed the king's hidden deformity each time it was played. The story reflects a recurring Celtic belief that the land itself preserves forgotten truths, allowing even nature to expose secrets that human beings try to conceal. March was so furious when the pipe revealed his secret that he nearly killed the musician who had played it. Only after being persuaded to blow into the instrument himself did he understand that the man was innocent. The strange reed would repeat the same message regardless of who used it. King March possessed the ears of a horse. This Welsh legend helps explain a curious episode in the Arthurian stories surrounding King Mark of Cornwall. Mallory portrays Mark as one of the most unpleasant rulers in the entire cycle, a cowardly, deceptive, and ruthless king whose behavior repeatedly brings him into conflict with Arthur's knights. The Cornish Mark and the Welsh March of Lynn were almost certainly two versions of the same legendary figure. Once that connection is recognized, a seemingly vague passage in Malory suddenly becomes much clearer. After Mark had provoked both Arthur and Lancelot, the knight Dinadan, famous for his sharp humor, decided to humiliate him through song. He composed a mocking lay and taught it to a harper named Eliot. Eliot then passed it on to many other musicians who carried the song into Wales and Cornwall. Malory merely says that it was the most insulting song ever performed with harp or any other instrument, but he never reveals its actual subject. The older Welsh and Irish traditions supply the missing detail. The song almost certainly repeated the ancient secret. King Mark had horse's ears. The wider mythology behind this tale leads naturally into Celtic beliefs about islands and the dead. Across many traditions, islands were imagined as places where departed souls could be safely separated from the living. Water was believed to form a powerful barrier against spirits. Once the dead had been carried across the sea, they were thought unlikely to return and trouble those who remained behind. Writers from antiquity preserve traces of this belief. Procopius, writing in the 6th century, describes traditions among the Celtic peoples of the continent in which the dead were transported across the water. Even earlier evidence may survive in Pliny, who quotes the Greek author Philemon concerning the Northern Ocean. According to this account, the Cimbri called part of the sea Mori Marusam. This has often been translated as the Dead Sea, but the expression may more accurately mean the Sea of the Dead, the ocean crossed by souls on their journey to the dwelling place of the departed. The Celtic imagination did not limit the otherworld to distant islands. Another common belief placed enchanted realms beneath lakes or under parts of the sea that had swallowed once inhabited lands. Nearly every great lake in Wales eventually acquired some story of a vanished settlement lying beneath its waters. Herds of supernatural cattle were believed to graze in these hidden regions, while the bells of drowned churches or cities could sometimes still be heard ringing from the depths. One of the best-known Welsh examples is Cantrea Gwaelod, the Lowland Hundred, a fertile kingdom said to have stretched westward from the coast near Aberdyfi. According to popular tradition, the entire land disappeared beneath the waters of Cardigan Bay. On quiet days, people claimed that the bells of the drowned kingdom could still be heard beneath the waves, counting out their mysterious rhythm from the lost country below. A later and more ordinary version of the story blames the disaster on Seithenin, the man responsible for maintaining the seawalls and floodgates. One night, overcome by drink, he neglected his duty, allowing the sea to burst through the defenses and destroy the kingdom. Yet the earliest surviving Welsh account presents a far more mythic explanation. In a poem preserved in the Black Book of Carmarthen, Seithenin is described not as a drunkard, but simply as a man lacking good judgment. The true responsibility falls upon a woman known as the guardian or servant of a sacred well. Her exact task is not explained, but the story strongly resembles an Irish legend connected with the creation of Lough Neagh. In that tale, a magical spring had to remain covered. When the woman responsible for it failed to replace the lid, the waters escaped and flooded the surrounding country. The catastrophe had been foreseen by a foolish or simple-minded member of the household, who occupies much the same role as Seithenin in the Welsh tradition. The woman in the Irish story was called Laibon. Her Welsh counterpart may survive under the name Lion, known from the tradition of the overflowing waters of Llyn Lion. The same name, perhaps altered over time, may also appear in Arthurian romance as Lyones. Malory describes Dame Lyones as a powerful lady served by her sister Lynette, who acts as her messenger and trusted companion. Lynette herself closely resembles Luned, the clever attendant found in the Welsh romance of Owain. Luned serves the Lady of the Fountain, just as Lynette serves Dame Lyones. Through this chain of similarities, Lyones can be connected not only with the Lady of the Fountain, but also with Laibon, the guardian of the magical spring in Irish tradition. She may even preserve features of another Laibon, queen of the supernatural ruler Labraid, and sister of the waterwoman Fand. Malory makes Dame Lyones the mistress of the Castle Perilous, situated near the Isle of Avalon. He also refers to a land and fortress called Lyones, supposedly located not far from Tintagel in Cornwall. Although he never explicitly links the woman, the castle, and the country, it is difficult to believe that their identical names are accidental. The confusion may have arisen because medieval writers increasingly identified Avalon with Glastonbury. Once Avalon is freed from that later geographical attachment and restored to the western seas, Lyonesse falls naturally into place. It becomes a submerged or vanished kingdom somewhere off the Cornish coast, perhaps imagined between Lundy and the Isles of Scilly. In this reconstruction, Dame Lyonesse becomes the ruler of a lost maritime realm bearing her own name. Such legendary countries provided appropriate homelands for Arthurian heroes. Tristram could be imagined as coming from the drowned land of Lyonesse, just as Galahault ruled the distant isles, and Lancelot emerged from the enchanted domain of the Lady of the Lake, who had raised him. The myths behind these romances may be extremely ancient. There is even a hint that heroic figures like Tristram or Lancelot were once compared with Heracles, for the geographer Ptolemy called Heartland Point the promontory of Heracles. Gower has already appeared as another region connected with the Celtic otherworld. It may have gained this reputation in the imagination of those living across the Severn Sea, particularly the Cornish Britons who saw its distant coastline rising beyond the water. Yet this explanation does not fully account for the similar reputation of Dyfed, the great southwestern region of Wales. It is easy to understand why distant northern territories could become associated with the dead. Mountains, forests, and hostile tribes separated them from the settled Brythonic kingdoms, making them seem remote and dangerous. Procopius appears to preserve a similar idea when he describes the region beyond a great dividing wall as a strange and threatening country. Dyfed, however, lacked the same dramatic northern barriers. Its reputation may instead have arisen from ethnic or political hostility. The ancient inhabitants of the region, known as the Demetae, may have been viewed as strangers or enemies by neighboring Brythonic peoples. Their territory could therefore have been transformed in mythology into a land of darkness and death. The exact frontier between the Demetae and the Silures is unknown. The River Towy might seem the obvious choice on a modern map, but the River Tawe may be a stronger possibility. If the Tawe formed the ancient boundary, then Gower and Dyfed need not be treated as two separate entrances to the otherworld. Both could have belonged to a single legendary region corresponding to the wider territory of ancient Demetia. A poem in the Black Book of Carmarthen seems to support the importance of the Tawe. In a dialogue between Gwyn ap Nudd and Gwyddno Garanhir, Gwyn invites Gwyddno to hurry toward his ridge, described as the dwelling place of the Tavwi. He makes clear that he does not mean the nearest river bearing that name, but another, more distant one. The image of Gwyn dwelling upon a ridge recalls the fairy court he was believed to possess on Glastonbury Tor. His association with the Tavwi also resembles other Celtic traditions in which rivers were governed by supernatural powers. The River Dee, for instance, was linked with a warlike female divinity whose waters were believed to foretell the fortunes of conflict between the Welsh and the English, depending on which bank the floods consumed. The Tavwi of the poem was probably the ancestor of the modern name Tawe, the river flowing through Swansea, known in Welsh as Abertawe. It is possible, however, that the passage referred to the River Tor in Devon, or another river with a similar ancient name. Whatever its exact location, the river seems to have acquired sacred significance because it marked the dwelling place or territory of Gwyn, king of the fairies and lord of the battlefield dead. This makes the Tawe an appropriate mythological frontier. The River Severn also deserves attention as a boundary between worlds. Gloucester, standing near its banks, appears in Welsh mythology as the location of supernatural women and as the prison of Mabon, son of Modron. The Welsh name of Gloucester, Caer Loiw, means the fortress of Gloiv, the Shining One. Its ancient Roman name, Glevum, preserves the same linguistic root. Gloiw may originally have belonged to the same broad family of supernatural rulers as Gwyn ap Nudd. The meaning of his name, bright or shining, resembles the meaning of Gwyn, white or fair. Both names are strangely luminous for figures associated with dark and mysterious realms. Yet this apparent contradiction is common in mythology, where dangerous or deathly beings are often described with names suggesting beauty, brightness, or purity. Welsh tradition connects Gloew with the family of Pryderi. In the Mabinogi, Pryderi marries Sigfa, granddaughter of Gloew Broadhair. Geoffrey of Monmouth later transformed Gloew into the Roman Emperor Claudius, apparently because Gloucester had yielded many coins from Claudius's reign. There is little genuine historical basis for the identification, but it allowed Geoffrey to combine local legend with Roman history. In Geoffrey's account, peace is established between Claudius and the British ruler Arviragus, called Gwairid in Welsh tradition. The alliance is sealed through marriage when Claudius gives his daughter to the British king. Yet Gwairid may simply be another form of Gri, an alternative name of Pryderi. Geoffrey's supposedly historical story may therefore be a reshaped version of the older myth in which Pryderi marries a descendant of Gloew. Other features of the narrative reveal its mythological roots. Gwairid helps Claudius conquer Orkney and distant islands, and on another occasion sends troops to spend the winter in Ireland. In the symbolic geography of Celtic tradition, islands such as these frequently represent lands of the dead. Geoffrey was therefore not merely recording military campaigns. He was transforming supernatural journeys into the language of royal conquest. Gloucester may have marked a very ancient cultural frontier. Its importance probably belonged to a period earlier than that represented by the Tawe. The Severn and the Tawe may therefore reflect two different stages in the westward expansion of Celtic settlement, each river becoming in turn a boundary between familiar territory and a region imagined as mysterious, hostile, or supernatural. Ancient writers offer further evidence that the islands around Britain were associated with gods, heroes, and the dead. Plutarch records the testimony of a traveler named Demetrius, who had been sent by the Roman emperor to investigate the islands surrounding Britain. According to Demetrius, many of these islands were uninhabited and were named after divine or heroic beings. He visited one island lying close to the empty ones and found only a small population. These inhabitants were regarded by the Britons as sacred and inviolable. Soon after Demetrius arrived, the atmosphere was violently disturbed. Fierce winds broke out, fiery signs appeared in the sky, and the island was shaken by terrifying natural events. When the storm finally ended, the islanders explained that one of the great supernatural beings had died. They compared the passing of a mighty soul to the extinguishing of a lamp. The lighting of a lamp brings no danger, they said, but its extinction causes grief and confusion. In the same way, the birth or appearance of a great spirit is joyful, while its death disturbs the winds, the waves, and even the health of the surrounding world. Demetrius was also told of another island where Cronus lay imprisoned in sleep. The giant Briareus guarded him, and sleep itself served as the chain that held the ancient god. Around Cronus gathered many lesser divine beings who acted as his servants and companions. This image has striking parallels in British legend. Welsh shepherds sometimes claim to have seen Arthur and his warriors sleeping in a hidden cave, waiting for the signal that would call them back into the world. The slumbering Cronus also resembles Bronn, guardian of the Holy Grail, dwelling in one of the mysterious islands of Ireland. Merlin presents another version of the same idea when he enters the glass house on Bardsey with his 9 bards and disappears forever from ordinary human society. These stories preserve a recurring pattern. A divine king does not truly die but withdraws into an island, cave, glass fortress, or hidden chamber. There he remains asleep, surrounded by loyal companions until the world requires his return. Plutarch's account also draws attention to the sacred status of people living on small islands near Britain. Similar traditions were recorded by Pomponius Mela concerning island communities off the coast of Brittany. Their inhabitants were not treated as ordinary people, but as figures protected by religious fear and ancient custom. This belief may help explain why early Christian hermits and holy men so often withdrew to remote islands. Solitude was certainly one reason, but the older pagan idea that island dwellers were untouchable may also have offered a measure of protection. Before the violent arrival of Norse raiders, the sacred reputation of such places may have made them especially attractive to religious communities. The transition from pagan belief to Christianity was therefore neither sudden nor complete. In Ireland, Druidic customs absorbed Christian ideas, while Christian practice adopted elements of the older sacred landscape. At times, it becomes difficult to determine precisely where Druidism ended and Christianity began. The same was probably true not only in Ireland, but throughout Celtic Britain. The old gods did not simply disappear. Their islands became the homes of saints, their magical women became Christian holy figures, their sleeping kings were transformed into Arthurian heroes, and their sacred boundaries were marked by churches, monasteries, and legends. Beneath the Christian surface, the ancient geography of the otherworld remained alive. One of the most fascinating mysteries surrounding the legends of King Arthur is how these stories traveled from the Celtic world into Norman and French literature. Historians have debated this question for generations, and while no single explanation has gained universal acceptance, several influential theories have shaped modern understanding. One of the earliest and most important interpretations came from the French scholar Gaston Parry. He argued that the Arthurian tradition entered French literature over roughly a century, beginning around the middle of the 12th century and reaching its full development before the end of the 13th. During this period, stories connected with Arthur became known in France as La Matière de Bretagne, or the Matter of Britain. In Parris's view, this phrase referred primarily to Great Britain rather than the Breton lands of northwestern France. According to this theory, the Norman expansion into Wales opened the door for Arthurian tales to spread across the English Channel. Welsh storytellers carried heroic adventures, magical episodes, and legendary characters into Norman courts, where these narratives quickly attracted aristocratic audiences. As interest grew in France and later across Europe, Breton traditions from Armorica also began contributing their own legends, enriching an already expanding cycle of stories. The transmission of these tales was almost certainly gradual rather than sudden. Arthurian traditions must have circulated for years before they appeared in written literature. Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, completed around 1136, is an excellent example. Although Geoffrey presented an ambitious Latin history of Britain and Arthur, his work had surprisingly little influence on the core material that later Romance writers adopted. This suggests that Arthurian legends were already deeply rooted in popular storytelling before Geoffrey's version reached readers. Not long afterward, Wace translated Geoffrey's history into French verse under the title Roman de Brut. His work reveals that Arthurian tradition had already become remarkably rich. Wace himself complained that storytellers had embroidered the legends so extensively that separating historical memory from imaginative invention had become nearly impossible. In other words, Arthur had already become the center of an enormous body of folklore. Gaston Parry believed these storytellers were largely Welsh performers. Some may have entertained audiences in England even before the Norman conquest, while others likely traveled afterward to noble courts throughout northern France. Moving from one household to another, they performed tales of heroic adventure, courtly love, enchanted kingdoms, and supernatural encounters, introducing Norman audiences to a literary world unlike anything they had previously known. Among these performers were musicians who presented what became known as Breton lays. These were not simply spoken stories, but performances that blended music with verse. The melodies formed an essential part of the experience, while the accompanying words explained the events being sung. Since many French listeners could not understand the original Celtic language, translations gradually emerged. These early adaptations eventually evolved into fully French literary works. Over time, the music disappeared, but the stories survived. The Breton lays were rewritten as narrative poems, usually composed in pairs of rhyming 8-syllable lines, most focused on romance, tragedy, loyalty, or extraordinary adventure. These poems became one of the foundations upon which later Arthurian literature was built. From this material emerged the great Arthurian romances. Writers transformed individual episodes into long poetic narratives intended to be read aloud rather than sung. The most celebrated among these authors was Chrétien de Troyes, whose works established the standard for nearly every romance that followed. His influence spread rapidly across medieval Europe and shaped the image of Arthur's court for centuries. Paris divided these romances into two broad categories. The first followed the complete life of a hero, tracing his journey from youth through his greatest adventures and, in some cases, to his death. These stories resemble medieval biographies, gathering many separate traditions into one continuous narrative. The second type concentrated on a single memorable adventure. Instead of covering an entire lifetime, these romances explored one dramatic episode involving a famous knight such as Gawain, allowing authors to develop suspense and character within a shorter story. Not every scholar accepted Gaston Paris's reconstruction. The German historian Heinrich Zimmer proposed a very different explanation. He questioned whether Welsh minstrels had played such a direct role in introducing Arthurian legend to the Normans. In his opinion, there was little convincing evidence that Welsh performers regularly entertained Norman audiences early enough to explain the rise of the romances. Zimmer also challenged the meaning of the expression "matter of Britain." He believed it referred not to Wales, but primarily to Brittany in northwestern France. Rather than traveling directly from Welsh storytellers to Norman listeners, the legends, he argued, were preserved and adapted by Breton communities whose language and culture gradually merged with Norman French society. Another major difference separated Zimmer from Paris. Instead of seeing the romances as descendants of lyrical lays, he argued that they ultimately developed from prose narratives. In his view, the ancient Celtic peoples preferred long prose stories rather than epic poems. When these narratives entered French literary culture, Norman writers reshaped them into verse because poetic romance suited their own artistic traditions. Even so, this interpretation does not entirely exclude Welsh influence. Welsh storytellers certainly continued to interact with Norman society after the conquest of Wales, and individuals such as the famous Bledri may well have served as cultural intermediaries. It is therefore possible that Arthurian literature drew upon both Breton and Welsh traditions at different stages of its development. The names preserved in the romances also hint at multiple sources. Familiar figures such as Gawain and Mordred appear in forms that seem to have entered French naturally through Breton usage. Other names, especially those connected with the Holy Grail cycle, appear much closer to their Welsh originals, suggesting that scribes translated or adapted them directly from Welsh traditions. These differences point toward a complex process of transmission rather than a single point of origin. The discussion also reveals something important about Celtic storytelling itself. Although many ancient Celtic narratives were written mainly in prose, they frequently inserted short poems into the action. These verses intensified emotion, highlighted dramatic moments, or allowed characters to express themselves in memorable language. Rather than interrupting the story, poetry became an integral part of the narrative rhythm. The Welsh tales preserved in the Mabinogi provide excellent examples of this technique. Their stories are overwhelmingly prose, yet brief poetic passages appear at key moments, giving additional depth to conversations or dramatic scenes. Other Welsh traditions contain even longer poetic exchanges between legendary figures. One striking example is a dialogue between Gawain and Tristan. Their conversation begins with words of caution and peace, before gradually moving toward friendship and reconciliation. Eventually, Gawain leads Tristan to Arthur, who warmly welcomes him into his court. The exchange demonstrates how poetry could advance a story while preserving its emotional intensity. These verses also reveal something about medieval performance. Much of their meaning is concentrated in the final line of each stanza, while the earlier lines create rhythm, imagery, and musical expectation. This pattern strongly suggests that such poetry was intended to accompany instrumental performance, most likely on the harp. The performer needed not only technical skill, but also clear delivery, because without the final line, the audience would miss the heart of the narrative. Whether Arthurian legend crossed the channel through Welsh storytellers, Breton intermediaries, or a combination of both, one conclusion is difficult to escape. The legends did not emerge from a single author or a single book. They evolved through generations of performers, translators, poets, and scribes, each adding new layers to an already living tradition. By the time the great French romances appeared, Arthur had become far more than a legendary king. He he had become the center of one of medieval Europe's richest and most influential storytelling traditions. Although only a handful of short verse passages survive within the earliest Welsh tales themselves, many more examples appear in medieval Welsh manuscripts. Collections such as the Red Book of Hergest and the Black Book of Carmarthen preserve numerous groups of these poems, many arranged as dramatic conversations between legendary figures. Some are dialogues between heroes and supernatural beings, while others belong to famous collections like the Englynion of the Graves, where poetry and memory combine to preserve the names of long-forgotten warriors. One striking feature of these poems is the way they deliver their meaning. The first two lines often create rhythm, atmosphere, or vivid imagery, but the real point usually arrives in the final line. It is there that the speaker's message reaches its conclusion. This pattern appears again and again, suggesting that these verses were designed for performance rather than silent reading. Sung with the accompaniment of a harp, the audience would wait for the final line, where the emotional or dramatic impact finally unfolded. Curiously, this simple poetic form is almost absent from manuscripts associated with famous court poets such as Aneurin and Taliesin. Those professional bards generally favored far more elaborate meters, intricate rhyme schemes, and deliberately complex language. By comparison, these three-line stanzas are clear, direct, and easy to understand. Their simplicity strongly suggests that they belong to popular tradition rather than elite literary circles. When arranged as conversations between characters, they may even have resembled a primitive form of musical drama, with alternating voices creating something close to an early opera. The most common version of this stanza consisted of 3 short lines, usually 7 syllables long, although an extra syllable occasionally appeared. Most examples followed a shared rhyme, but strict rhyme was never compulsory. Sometimes only 2 lines matched, while the remaining lines stood apart. Medieval poets also experimented freely with the structure, occasionally expanding the stanza to 4 or more lines without abandoning its familiar rhythm. One poem from the Englynion of the Graves illustrates this flexibility by adding a 4th line to commemorate warriors buried upon a mountain. Even with the extra line, the musical flow remains recognizable, demonstrating how adaptable this poetic tradition had become. Another important variety followed a different rhythm altogether. Instead of 3 equal lines, it combined a long opening line with shorter lines that followed. The first line often carried additional syllables beyond the regular pattern. Medieval Welsh scholars referred to these extra words as the gair circ, literally an approaching word. Although they extended the line, they were treated almost as ornaments rather than part of its core rhythm. Sometimes these extra words echoed sounds found in the following line, creating subtle patterns of assonance that listeners would recognize even without perfect rhyme. Examples preserved in the dialogue between Gwyn ap Nudd and Gwyno Garanhir demonstrate how this system worked. The main rhyme might not appear until later in the stanza, while the additional introductory word quietly established another layer of sound. Such careful craftsmanship reveals that Welsh poets were experimenting with musical effects centuries before later medieval verse became highly formalized. Some of the oldest surviving examples reach back to the 9th century, appearing in manuscripts connected with the Welsh version of the Juvencus Gospel paraphrase. These religious poems employ exactly the same metrical principles as secular heroic verse, showing that the poetic form crossed freely between sacred and worldly subjects. Whether praising God or recounting heroic exploits, the underlying structure remained remarkably consistent. Even earlier evidence may survive in stone inscriptions dating to the 5th or 6th century. One Latin epitaph, when its words are arranged according to Welsh metrical principles, closely resembles the opening lines of a traditional Welsh stanza. If this interpretation is correct, it would suggest that the foundations of Welsh poetic technique were already developing soon after the end of Roman Britain. Whether or not every inscription truly belongs to this tradition, one conclusion remains difficult to dispute. Poetry was already an established part of Welsh culture at a remarkably early date. These short lyrical forms were never isolated literary curiosities. Instead, they blended naturally into longer prose narratives, enriching heroic tales with moments of emotion, dialogue, and dramatic emphasis. This close partnership between prose and poetry became one of the defining characteristics of early Celtic storytelling. Rather than composing vast epics entirely in verse, Welsh authors preferred prose narratives that paused at important moments to introduce songs, speeches, or lyrical reflections. The result was a style of storytelling that balanced flowing narrative with memorable poetic performances. Interestingly, one poetic form common in medieval French literature appears to have been relatively uncommon in Wales itself. French Breton lays were typically written as rhyming octosyllabic couplets, yet this meter rarely dominates surviving Welsh material. In Brittany, however, poems built on this pattern became extremely popular. Even allowing for later French influence, this difference supports the argument that Breton literary traditions developed along somewhat different lines from those preserved in Wales. This distinction also strengthens another influential theory concerning Celtic literature. Some scholars have argued that the Celts preferred prose narratives as their primary vehicle for heroic storytelling, while poetic passages served to heighten key moments rather than carry the entire story. The surviving Welsh evidence fits this model remarkably well. The Mabinogi provides an especially revealing example. In the Tale of Math, Gwydion undertakes a delicate diplomatic mission disguised as a professional bard. When he arrives at King Pryderi's court, he is invited to entertain the assembled nobles. Significantly, he does not begin by singing a poem. Instead, he offers to tell stories. The narrative explains that he delighted the entire court through conversations, historical tales, and entertaining narratives, earning widespread admiration through his skill as a storyteller rather than as a singer. Later in the same collection, Gwydion again appears in disguise, this time visiting the court of Arianrhod. Once more, the conversation centers on stories and historical narratives instead of musical performance. The Welsh terminology consistently points towards spoken storytelling rather than sung poetry. These details are remarkably revealing. Although the surviving manuscripts date mainly from the 13th and 14th centuries, they almost certainly preserve traditions copied from considerably older sources. They depict a society in which the highest-ranking bard could comfortably serve as both poet and storyteller. Narrative prose carried prestige equal to verse, suggesting that storytelling occupied a central place in Welsh intellectual life long before these texts were written down. Beyond questions of language, poetry, and literary form lies an even greater achievement. Celtic storytelling profoundly influenced medieval European literature. A 12th century French poet famously declared that every great writer drew inspiration from only three great traditions: France, Britain, and Imperial Rome. Arthurian Britain therefore stood beside the greatest literary worlds of medieval imagination. The influence spread far beyond France. Arthurian romances captivated audiences across Germany and much of continental Europe, inspiring generations of poets, translators, and chroniclers. Their appeal crossed linguistic and political boundaries with remarkable ease. The contrast with early English literature is particularly striking. Before the Norman conquest, English poets had already created magnificent works such as Beowulf, heroic poems celebrating battles like Finnesburg and Malden, along with religious epics and lyrical compositions including The Wanderer. These masterpieces formed a rich literary tradition of their own. Yet after the Norman period, Arthurian legend rapidly emerged as one of the dominant imaginative forces in Britain, eventually becoming one of the most enduring narrative traditions in all of European literature. The Norman conquest transformed far more than England's political landscape. It also reshaped the country's literary tradition so completely that much of the earlier English heritage faded into obscurity. The heroic poems that had once celebrated Anglo-Saxon warriors, including masterpieces like Beowulf, had almost no influence on the literature that emerged after 1066. For medieval readers, these ancient works were largely forgotten, surviving only in neglected manuscripts that would not attract serious attention again until many centuries later. Their disappearance from the literary mainstream reflects just how profound the cultural changes of the Norman era truly were. Rather than continuing the traditions of Anglo-Saxon poetry, post-conquest English literature followed entirely different paths. The old literary current was effectively redirected, leaving behind the themes, styles, and heroic ideals that had once dominated English storytelling. This dramatic shift demonstrates the depth of Norman influence, not only over government and society, but also over the imagination of medieval England. Ironically, the Normans themselves did not introduce a body of literature that was strongly Norse or Germanic in character. By the time they conquered England, their culture had become deeply rooted in the French-speaking world. Their literary tastes reflected continental influences far more than Scandinavian ones. Alongside them came Breton allies whose Celtic heritage would prove especially significant in shaping the stories that later flourished throughout Britain. In the centuries that followed, medieval English literature developed around 4 major narrative traditions. 3 of these arrived from continental Europe. One centered on the legends of ancient Troy, inspired by accounts attributed to Darius Phrygius. Another celebrated the exploits of Alexander the Great, whose life became the subject of countless medieval romances. A third revolved around Charlemagne and his legendary knights, presenting tales of crusades, chivalry, and imperial heroism that spread across much of Europe. The fourth tradition had a different origin. It drew its inspiration from the Celtic world, particularly from Wales and Brittany. This was the Arthurian cycle, enriched further by Geoffrey of Monmouth's influential writings. Of all the great literary traditions that entered medieval England, none left a deeper mark than the stories of King Arthur and his companions. Their popularity surpassed that of the Trojan legends, the romances of Alexander, and the Charlemagne cycle, eventually becoming one of the defining features of English literary culture. Religious writing also flourished during the Middle Ages, yet even here Celtic influence can be detected. Christian narratives increasingly blended with legendary themes associated with Britain, incorporating mystical elements that surrounded the search for the Holy Grail. These stories combined spiritual symbolism with adventure, creating narratives that appealed to both religious devotion and the medieval fascination with wonder and miracle. The influence of Celtic tradition did not end with the Middle Ages. Across the centuries, many of England's greatest writers returned to Arthurian themes and Celtic imagination for inspiration. Authors such as William Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, Alfred Tennyson, and Algernon Charles Swinburne each drew upon this rich legendary heritage, adapting ancient material to suit the literary tastes of their own generations. Their works helped ensure that Celtic legend remained a living part of English culture long after the medieval romances had passed. Viewed from this perspective, the ancestry of English literature differs significantly from the ancestry of the English people themselves. While England's population developed through a mixture of Germanic, Norman, and many other influences, its literary tradition became shaped by a remarkably strong Celtic current. Arthurian legend stands at the heart of that inheritance, connecting medieval romance with later masterpieces of English poetry and prose. For that reason, exploring the origins and evolution of the Arthurian legends is about far more than tracing the history of a single heroic figure. It offers a window into the formation of one of the richest literary traditions in Europe. Anyone interested in Celtic civilization, medieval history, or the development of English literature will inevitably encounter Arthur's world, whose stories have continued to inspire readers, writers, and audiences for nearly 1,000 years. Dan Chue.